The committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. Let me welcome our witnesses. Thank you for your time and expertise this morning. Welcome to members of the public and the press as well. Today we'll examine U.S. strategy toward China. China represents a profound strategic challenge all around the world, economically, geopolitically, and even potentially militarily. At the same time, China is a necessary, if sometimes difficult, partner in certain areas. In 2019, we mark 40 years since the United States normalized relations with the People's Republic of China. We did so then because we recognize what remains true today. The U.S.-China relationship is one of the most consequential relationships in the world. In many ways, the nature of that relationship shapes the world we live in today, so we need to get it right. Over the past 4 decades, the United States has facilitated China's rise. We supported China joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, which opened the Chinese market and helped bring the country into the world economy. American firms and venture capital have flowed into China over the years, including in the Chinese technology market, which has become a matter of strategic concern for our government today. The United States made a gamble that as China became more and more involved on the global stage, it would open up domestically and become a constructive stakeholder in the international system. It's pretty clear that gamble hasn't paid off in the way we hoped it would. While the United States has been embroiled in costly and seemingly endless conflict in the Middle East over the last 2 decades, China has grown into the second-largest economy in the world, a fact that has propelled many of China's geopolitical ambitions. Our original hope was that this growth would come in tandem with China abandoning its authoritarian tendencies, that we could somehow shape Beijing's incentives to better fit our interests, but that just hasn't come to pass. China today under Xi Jinping is a powerful nation with a long-term agenda and vast resources. In global affairs, China often stands opposite the United States, and not just on democratic values or support for human rights. As the United States retreats from the world under the Trump administration's policies, Xi Jinping is eager to present China as an alternative to the American model of global leadership. But it's a stark reality. Bullying China's neighbors in the South China Sea, exploiting corrupt officials to smooth the way for strategic investments in Africa and Latin America, building out a global technology infrastructure beholden to Beijing's interests, putting more than 1 million Muslims in Western China in concentration camps, and managing to keep the world silent about it. There's no question that China is a determined actor that doesn't share our country's fundamental values. I'm pleased that the Trump administration's national security strategy identified China as a competitor and Chinese influence globally as a challenge that must be prioritized. But competition itself is not a strategy. The scale of these challenges demands that we put forward a cohesive, coordinated response to China. We should work with our allies to develop and implement that strategy. After all, our allies are the greatest advantage when it comes to advancing our interests and values around the world. As we sit here, the Trump administration is preparing for another round of trade talks with Chinese leaders tomorrow. Up to $200 billion in additional tariffs are possible, according to the administration. Our negotiators should seek to get the best deal possible for American workers, but trade wars and bellicose rhetoric alone are certainly not a strategy. So the question is, what does a smart competition with China look like? It starts with investment here at home to make the United States more competitive. That's what China's been doing for years, while we have poured energy and resources into costly wars and tax cuts for the wealthy and spent far too little investing in our people in the middle class and in areas like infrastructure, scientific research, and education. We also need to double down on our strengths. The United States has long been a global leader that articulates our values, our commitment to democratic principles of openness, freedom, and human rights. We haven't always lived out these values perfectly, and right now it seems like we can barely see them in the rearview mirror. But if we fail to hold them up As a global standard, we do ourselves a great disservice. This is certainly an area where we distinguish ourselves from China. And while doing all of this, we must work with China on challenges we all share, from non-proliferation to climate change to global health and pandemics. Our interests often align with those of China. We must be able to work together to tackle these global challenges. I'm eager to hear from our witnesses on how we should be orienting ourselves toward the next 40 years in the U.S.-China relationship. But first, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member McCall for any remarks he might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Chinese Communist Party is a clear and growing threat to the United States. Between their Made in China 2025 plan, Belt and Road Initiative, and forceful land grab in the South China Sea, they pose an active and serious threat to the United States economy, developing countries, global democracy, and human rights. After 40 years of engagement with China, we are at an historic inflection point in our relationship. And I want to thank you, Chairman Engel, for calling this hearing so we can better highlight what China is doing today. When the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China 40 years ago, our GDP was $2.6 trillion, and theirs was $178 million, 14 times their size. Today, China is getting close to achieving economic parity with the United States, having reached $12 trillion in 2017 GDP compared to our $19 trillion. China has also grown in military strength, technological sophistication, and spread its Belt and Road influence well beyond its neighbors. Just this Monday, Secretary Pompeo detailed China's designs on the Arctic, including the development of shipping lanes in the Arctic Ocean. Next month will mark the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square massacre, when tanks rolled over pro-democracy protesters and crushed the dream of a freer society under the party's iron fist rule. Today, as many as 3 million ethnic minority Muslims are imprisoned in what an Assistant Secretary of Defense characterized last week as concentration camps. And when Secretary Pompeo released this year's State Department's human rights reports, he said that China is in a league of its own when it comes to human rights violations. Under President Xi, the party's evils at home are being spread abroad. The party is seeking to establish dominance over neighboring countries, including Taiwan, and they are seizing maritime territories, developing military capabilities intended to hamstring American forces, and projecting authoritarian influence around the world. The party's malign agenda touches the United States as well. In 2014, it was revealed that Chinese hackers stole 22.5 million security clearances, including my own. Today, the United States Justice Department is working to hold China accountable for their blatant intellectual property theft from U.S. businesses. Their economic ambitions have been achieved at the expense of American ideas and innovation, and this behavior is simply and completely unacceptable. At the Senate's Worldwide Threats hearing this year, the DNI testified that Chinese aggression was, quote, a long-term strategy to achieve global superiority, close quotes, through domestic repression, unfair economic practices, and military expansion. If our views and actions towards China remain complacent, as they were in previous decades, not recognizing their true threat, in another 40 years, the world will look very different than it does today for my children, our grandchildren. And that is why I was pleased that we took this bipartisan action. Just yesterday, the House passed my Championing American Business Through Diplomacy Act, which I introduced with Chairman Engel. This legislation makes the promotion of U.S. economic interest a principal duty of our missions abroad. It also requires economic and commercial training for our diplomats serving overseas. Promotion of American businesses abroad has never been more important. Where China brings their debt trap financing, predatory lending, their companies and their workers, America facilitates fair financing using local companies and workers. Our alternative fosters stability and security, while theirs brings just the opposite. If America does not step up its economic engagement in the world, this vacuum will be filled by others with a potentially devastating impact on American national security. So with that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to this discussion. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Economy, the CV Star Senior Fellow and Director for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She is an acclaimed author and a leading scholar on Chinese domestic and foreign policy. Her most recent book addresses the impact of Xi Jinping's leadership on the Chinese state. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to introduce Ms. Sam Sachs, Cybersecurity Policy and China Digital Economy Fellow at New America and a recognized expert on the U.S.-China technology relationship and China's cybersecurity regime. Welcome as well. Next, Ms. Kelly Maximin is the Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress and formerly served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs at the Pentagon. Welcome. And finally, I want to welcome Dr. Aaron Friedberg, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University and co-director of the Woodrow Wilson School's Center for International Security Studies. Dr. Friedberg also served as Deputy Assistant for National Security Affairs in the Office of Vice President Dick Cheney. I'll now recognize you for 5 minutes each to summarize your testimony, and we'll put anything that you want to submit into the record that you don't say would be fine. Let's start with Dr. Economy. Could you just either push the button or?
Good start. Yes. Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee for inviting me here to speak this morning as part of such a distinguished panel. I'd like to begin just by unpacking the concept of smart competition to frame my remarks. As I understand it, smart competition means that we know what we're competing for, that we have an objective in mind. It means that we know our competitor, and we know our competitor's strengths and weaknesses, and it means we know what resources we have, what resources we need, and we know how to marshal those resources effectively. I think in this context, U.S.-China relationship, that we are falling short. First, we have no clear sense for what we are fighting for. I think the administration and Congress have done a very good job of understanding the challenges and potential challenges that China poses, but that we are largely playing a defensive game. And a defensive game is not a very good strategy for competition. We need a positive and proactive vision of the United States, of where the United States stands within itself, where it stands in the Asia-Pacific region, and where it stands on the global stage, not just for today, but for 2026 when the United States turns 250 years old, or for 2050. China has such a vision, and it allows it to set its priorities, its policies, and to figure out how to allocate its resources. I think that the administration's free and open Indo-Pacific offers a good starting point. It reflects U.S. values. These are values that are shared by our allies. And it reframes the competition away from the United States versus China, a competition that we are going to lose in many different ways, to our advantage, right? To an advantage that is based and rooted in our essential values, and again, the values that are shared by our allies. Second, do we understand China? I think we're getting there. We're making progress. It's a complicated, complex country. I tried to lay out some thoughts in my written testimony, but we need a pipeline of expertise that begins in our secondary schools, through our colleges, graduate schools, and into the U.S. government. Reports that it is more difficult today for young experts, young people who've spent their training and their time learning Chinese and studying in China, reports that it's more difficult for them now to enter the government. That's moving us in the wrong direction, right? We shouldn't be penalizing people for developing expertise. And we certainly shouldn't be penalizing Chinese Americans as well. We also need cooperation with China, and I was heartened to hear the chairman mention this in his remarks. Cooperation not only is essential for addressing many of the global challenges that we face and many bilateral and common interests that we have, but it's also essential for us to understand China, right? If we cut off cooperation, if we cut off exchanges, if we begin to develop a visa policy that is restricting our exchanges, then we're losing again, because we lose our insight into this country. And finally, have we mastered or are we marshaling our resources effectively? I think there are some bright spots, and I think Congress is responsible for some of them. The Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, the BUILD Act, I think are both very important. I think we have people in our government, Matt Pottinger, Randy Shriver, who are internationalists and multilateral in their orientation, who are working together to advance a proactive and positive policy. And I think our military gets it. They understand what free and open Indo-Pacific means, and they're trying to marshal their resources. But we do not have a coherent and constructive and coordinated approach across the various agencies of our government, and we need that. We need a message to come down from the President that reaffirms our support of the free and open Indo-Pacific. We need our public diplomacy and our political capacity building and our trade and investment strategy and our military all to row in the same direction. We need a calling card. It is not enough for us to condemn Chinese policies, Belt and Road Initiative or Made in China 2025, or any of the other myriad policies that we rightly find offensive and challenging. But what is it that we are bringing to the table? Vice President Pence announced an initiative on smart cities back in the meeting, the U.S.-ASEAN meeting last fall, but I haven't seen any evidence that we're truly developing this. Why not develop a smart and sustainable cities program, something, again, that would bring together various parts of our administration and announce a positive and proactive role for the United States? And finally, I think Congress has an important role. In addition to writing, drafting, and passing legislation, it has a diplomatic role that it could play. For example, when we look at this Huawei discussion, I look around many of the countries that I visit in Europe and Asia, and there are a lot of divisions within these governments between the security elements and the their equivalent of the State Departments and foreign ministries. There are different perspectives. Congress should be engaging with their counterparts to help sort of energize the debate in a way that supports the U.S. perspective. We suffer a diplomatic deficit at our top-level leadership, and Congress needs to step up to help fill that. And Congress, I think, plays an important role, or a potentially important role, as a convener of the various parts of American society that need to get behind this effort. I spent the past about 3 or 4 months out at Stanford University as a visiting fellow, and being there on the West Coast, I can tell you, you get a very different perspective from a university in the tech community and then a very significant Chinese-American community. These are communities that need to be engaged. Congress needs to learn from them, and they also need to learn from Congress. So I hope through informal briefing sessions as well as hearings that you are drawing in other parts of the community that are deeply invested in the U.S.-China relationship. So I'll just conclude by saying, I think FBI Director Wray had it just about right when he said that this is a whole of government and whole of society response that we need for China. I would just add that it needs to be a whole of the world response as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Economy. I'd now like to introduce Ms. Sam Sachs, Cybersecurity Policy and China Digital Economy Fellow.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. I have worked on Chinese technology issues for over a decade, both with the national security community and in the private sector. The United States and China are locked in a deepening conflict over technology, which is likely to continue for years to come, whatever happens with the trade agreement this week or soon. Beijing is doubling down on aspirations for China to become a cyber superpower. These aspirations manifest through a state-driven approach to cementing China's leadership in emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and 5G networks that will enable ubiquitous computing as more physical systems rely on software. I refer the committee to my testimony from March before the Senate Commerce Subcommittee on Security, in which I spoke about source code reviews, localization pressures, and restrictions on cross-border data flows that compel tech transfer and impede market access. I would be happy to answer any questions about this in the hearing. Additionally, there are national security and human rights dimensions. So what is to be done? Overall, the U.S. policy position needs to be based on a small yard, high fence approach This is a phrase from former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. It essentially means being selective about what technologies we want to protect, but aggressive in protecting them. Overreach in the form of blanket bans, unwinding global supply chains, and discrimination against Chinese individuals is not the answer. The line between US and Chinese technological development is not as clear as the political borders between the two countries as it was during the Cold War. We belong to an interconnected system when it comes to research, development, manufacturing, and talent. Not all Chinese students, researchers, and scientists are spies. Treating them as such is dangerous to US national interests. So how do we maintain the openness of the US system in a way that is less vulnerable to exploitation? Is it possible to build a system that is both open and resilient? Yes, I believe we can and we must. Let's first talk about export controls. The Department of Commerce has issued a list of emerging technologies that may be subject to new export controls due to their importance for national security and has solicited feedback from industry. I'd like to offer a framework that can help us arrive at a more specific list of technologies and their applications. Technology should be subject to greater control if it is essential to military technology, but not simply used by the military. 2, there is a scarcity of knowledge about that technology. And 3, that technology is developed exclusively in the United States or other countries that enforce similar export controls so as to avoid designing out of US-made components. Reviews should be conducted by both military and non-military stakeholders, and the findings must be regularly reevaluated and updated. A second issue. Right now in Xinjiang, the Chinese government is detaining large numbers of ethnic Muslims and using a range of technologies like biometric scans, facial recognition, to enable mass incarceration and surveillance. There needs to be a process to systematically consider the ethical harm that can result from seemingly benign, open-source US-China collaboration on basic AI research. But to date, there has been no systematic study of this. Export controls may not be the best tool for this, but I recommend that the United States engage with international standards bodies to develop a guide for how we can think about ethical collaboration on academic AI. It's not a simple task. First, many AI applications are inherently dual use, so it's almost impossible to determine at times what is military and what is civilian. Second, it is very difficult to prevent code from going across borders. Many state-of-the-art AI systems are openly published online. And third, the United States derives benefit from working with Chinese researchers who are frankly doing very cutting-edge work on similar problem sets as we are. There are also national security risks to losing visibility into China's advancements. I would suggest a process to evaluate how we can think about the nature of different collaborations, the possibility that the Chinese government may co-opt private sector or academic projects, the level of technology diffusion and development towards application. This is just the beginning of the conversation. Last, the United States must play offense by investing in its own R&D, infrastructure, and STEM education. China will not abandon its technological ambitions, so we must be able to compete in our own right. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Sachs. Ms. Maximin.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to testify today about the challenge that China presents to the United States and what we should be doing about it. I also commend this committee for taking on this topic so comprehensively. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for their immense scholarship on China, which I turn to often to inform my own views. I have submitted for the record a written statement as well as a recent Center for American Progress strategy on China that I co-authored with Dr. Melanie Hart. I hope our report and its recommendations will prove useful to the committee as you take this effort forward. I'd like to offer 4 general observations. First, at the 40th anniversary of U.S.-China relations, we are entering a new competitive phase in our relationship that will need to be managed carefully by both sides. China has been in competition with us for a while, but we have been so invested in the Middle East and South Asia and paralyzed politically at home that we have failed to take adequate action for many years. Going forward, we will need to make better choices about where we place our strategic focus, not just overseas, but also here at home. And yes, there will indeed be choices, and we will need to accept some risk in taking them, whether it is what defense and security investments we make, what diplomatic efforts we choose to pursue, and what resource trade-offs we make across the national enterprise. The nature of this competition will be comprehensive. Second, in this regard, I believe that the competition with China will be defined as much by what we do to make ourselves competitive in Michigan and Ohio as what we do in the South China Sea. Whether we successfully compete will be more about how we invest in our greatest strength, the American people, than in how many aircraft carriers we have. And I say that as a former senior defense official. Over the past few decades, China has funneled trillions of dollars into public education, public infrastructure upgrades, high-tech research and development, and global diplomacy. At the same time, Washington has dialed back investments in the fundamental pillars of national strength, and most importantly, the American people. Third, the United States cannot compete with China alone. We need our friends, whether to confront China's unfair trade practices or to uphold international law in the South China Sea. Generating a U.S.-China competition on a purely bilateral basis does not leverage the collective strength of our allies. It also puts some countries in a position of feeling forced to choose, a dynamic we should scrupulously avoid. Finally, U.S. policymakers should be cautious about overcorrecting on competition. We cannot abandon our democratic values. In fact, we should see those values as our comparative advantage on the field. They are what make us different from China and more attractive to others. Likewise, we should avoid painting competition as somehow civilizational. That is not only wrong-headed, but counterproductive. And even as we compete, we should remember that U.S.-China relations have also yielded constructive results for mankind. With these observations in mind, I recommend the United States pursue a three-pronged strategy with respect to China: limit, leverage, and compete. First, we need to limit China's ability to exploit our open system without sacrificing our values. Second, we need to leverage China's growing capabilities to advance collective interests where it makes sense for us. Third, we need to compete at full national strengths with major investments in our comparative advantage, the American people. In conclusion, the United States can manage this new phase in our relationship with China. We should be confident in our abilities, but vigilant to what is necessary to compete effectively. And while much of the national effort required will go well beyond the jurisdiction of this committee, we must view this challenge comprehensively because that is how China views us. We can compete with China without sacrificing our values or driving ourselves into unnecessary conflict. But we have to change course now. We need to put in place some better fundamentals, both here at home and abroad. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Maximin. Dr. Friedberg.
Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to testify. I'd like to touch on three issues. First, what our strategy towards China.
Can you pull the microphone a little closer? Yeah.
Second, what China's strategy appears to be. And then third, how we might adjust our strategy in light of those insights. I'd like to begin by endorsing a point that Chairman Engel made in his opening statement. The strategy of engaging with China that we've been pursuing for the last 40 years, I think, was not a blunder, but it was a gamble, and it's become increasingly obvious that the gamble hasn't paid off. China has clearly become richer and stronger, but the CCP regime has become even more repressive and more militantly nationalistic. It continues to deploy market-distorting, mercantilist economic policies, and its external behavior has become increasingly aggressive. The simplest explanation for the failure of U.S. strategy is that it underestimated the resilience, the resourcefulness, and the ruthlessness of the Chinese Communist Party and its determination to hold on to domestic political power. China's rulers appear to have three consistent strategic objectives. First and foremost, to preserve the power of the CCP. Second, to restore China to what the regime sees as its proper historic status as the preponderant power in Eastern Eurasia, and third, to become a truly global power with influence and presence on par with and perhaps eventually superior to that of the United States. And the key point, I think, is that the last two goals are related to the first. As their power has grown, China's leaders have begun to reach out beyond their borders in an attempt to reshape the world in ways that they believe will make it less threatening and more conducive to the survival of their regime. In some, they're trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, or at least for perpetual CCP rule of China. And this shift towards a more assertive stance began to become visible in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, and it's intensified markedly since the rise to power of Xi Jinping in 2012-2013. There's obviously ambition here. China's leaders believe that the U.S. is in decline and that their time has come. But there's also a good deal of insecurity and a sense of urgency. Like his predecessors, Xi fears dissent, social instability, and political unrest. He knows that China faces serious difficulties in sustaining economic growth and dealing with the needs of its aging population, among other problems. And one reason the CCP regime is pressing so hard now may be that they see a window of opportunity that they don't think is going to stay open forever. In its own neighborhood, China is trying to use its growing military capabilities to undermine the credibility of America's security guarantees and push the U.S. away, while relying on political influence operations and the increasing gravitational attraction of its own massive economy to pull others towards it. And ultimately, they seem to envision a new regional system that would extend across much of Eurasia, linked together by infrastructure and trade agreements with China at its center and America's democratic allies either integrated and subordinated or weakened and isolated, and the United States pushed to the periphery, if not out of East Asia altogether. As regards their global ambitions, they believe that in every historical period there's a dominant power that gets to set the rules and shape the institutions in ways that serve its own interests and reflect its ideology. And in the long run, I think the regime aims to surpass the United States in terms of material capabilities and to usurp its role in shaping the international order. Of course, it's one thing to have such ambitions, quite another actually to fulfill them. So in light of these considerations, how should we adjust our strategy? The root of our problems with Beijing, in my view, is the character of the CCP regime. This is not a civilizational struggle, but it's a contest between two opposing political systems and two contending visions for the future of Asia and the world. And the history of the last several decades suggests that we have very limited capacity to encourage positive change in China, certainly not by offering yet more rewards and inducements. We need to deal with China as it is, not how we would wish it to be. But for that reason, we need to acknowledge that for the foreseeable future, the prospects for stable cooperative relations are very limited. Beijing is going to continue to push, and unless we choose to give way, a period of intensifying rivalry is therefore inevitable. A second point that should be obvious but bears repeating, and several have already said it, our prospects in this rivalry will be greatly enhanced if we can find ways to cooperate more effectively with our democratic friends and allies. Looking ahead, I think our strategy will have to be two parts defensive and one part offensive. First, and perhaps most obvious, together with our friends and allies, we need to counter Beijing's attempts to expand its influence through coercion and subversion. And in the Indo-Pacific region, that's at root a problem of military planning and collective defense. At the same time as we seek to block some of the many vectors of China's outward expansion, we, together with our friends and allies, have to take steps to better protect our own societies, economies, and political systems from exploitation and manipulation. And this is a difficult problem, and I think it's one that we've only begun to wrestle with. In the political domain, the question is how we can best protect ourselves against Chinese influence operations without sacrificing the openness that's historically been our greatest source of strength. And in the economic realm, the challenge will be to defend against China's predatory practices, protect our technological advantages, and avoid doing things that make it easier for Beijing to sustain its current economic model without imposing undue costs on ourselves. Third and finally, we can't afford to remain entirely on the defensive in our evolving competition with China. We need to find ways to impose costs on Beijing for its egregious and harmful behavior, both at home and abroad. The proximate aim of our new strategy must be not to change the character of the CCP regime, but to protect ourselves against it. We need to demonstrate to China's current rulers that they can't succeed if they continue along their present path. In the process, it's possible that we could help to set in motion forces that will lead eventually to meaningful change. But in the meantime, to paraphrase George Kennan, we're going to have to look to our own defenses while we await the breakup or gradual mellowing of CCP power. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. I'll now recognize members for the purpose of questioning witnesses. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. The Trump administration has said that the U.S. and China are now in an era of competition. It's hard to disagree, which is why this is the first of 5 hearings on China in the Foreign Affairs Committee this week. But we want to make sure we get this right. Terms like new Cold War are being thrown around, which concerns many of our partners who simply do not want to be forced to choose between the U.S. and China. Dr. Economy, in your written testimony, you discuss how the U.S.-China relationship has been based in part, on a mutual understanding that neither side benefited from letting the relationship deteriorate too much. Your testimony also, Ms. Magsamen, your testimony also highlights some of the risks associated with focusing exclusively on competition with China. So let me ask you both. Under the leadership of Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, does this basic assumption about the importance of relative stability in the U.S.-China relationship still hold? As we adjust our policy toward China, are you concerned that the U.S. policy is overcorrecting toward competition? And finally, what do you think the U.S.'s strategy objective should be in a competition with China? Whoever would like to start.
So I would say, certainly with this administration, there's much less interest in trying to identify areas of potential cooperation with China. But I think in this era of strategic competition, identifying those areas is more important than ever. We may not be able to find areas such as climate change, right, giant areas of global cooperation, but certainly technical cooperation on things like drug trafficking, on sort of refugee issues, other areas. We should be able to identify a number of places where we can continue to work together. I think, again, civil society efforts should not be maligned. We should be looking to engage, working with our Chinese counterparts in environmental protection, areas of poverty alleviation. All of these things actually give hope to reformers within China. They still exist, and if we close off cooperation, we're actually closing off a lifeline for them. So I think we need to be thinking not only at the level of government-to-government cooperation, but also in terms of maintaining the civil society contacts and dialogues. So it's more difficult, I would say, but it's even more important. And we can do things in multilateral fashion as well. It just doesn't have to be about the United States and China. We can cooperate in third countries, as we have in the past. Public health in Africa was an important initiative that has somewhat gone moribund. We should be talking about development finance standards. There are lots of different ways that we can go at issues that concern us about China through dialogue, not just through pushing back.
Ms. Sachs?
So I talked about the ethics of AI, and I think that this also is an area of potential collaboration. Not many people may be aware, but there's an important project underway in China. This week, actually, a new report was released looking at issues around AI safety and the ethics there. So although there are areas in which I think we have significant disagreements, we are all struggling with what are the rules for these emerging technologies? How are they going to be deployed? What are important questions? And so this is an area where it is in our benefit to work with counterparts in China that are also in the midst of writing standards around how technologies of the future will be used and the social and economic implications of that.
Thank you very much. Ms. Magsamen, let me ask you this. The Swedish think tank SIPRI reported that the U.S. military spending in 2018 was $649 billion, which is the highest in the world, and more than almost the next 8 top spenders combined. Excuse me. However, more spending doesn't necessarily mean better outcomes, and it's important to remember that while the U.S. has been fighting wars in the Middle East, China has been investing at home. So let me ask you, is the United States building the kind of military necessary to fight a potential conflict in the Asia-Pacific, or are we still primarily building a military that perhaps due to bureaucratic inertia or entrenched interests may not be as effective in such a conflict? Ms. Magsamen, would you like to try that?
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's a very good question. You're right. China spends about $170 billion a year, and that's just publicly what we know they spend on defense. And we, of course, are about 7 times higher than that. I will say, however, that the gap between China's military spending and the military spending of some of our closest allies in the region is pretty severe. For example, Taiwan only spends about $10.6 billion a year, Japan spends $47 billion a year, and India spends $60 billion a year. So there is a significant gap in defense spending between China and our allies, which I think is an important consideration. I also think that it's not really how much we spend on defense, it's what we spend it on. I think that some of the investments we've made in the past with respect to surface vessels and sort of more traditional means of defense are going to be completely invalid, potentially in a conflict with China. So we're going to have to make some defense investments in areas where we have a comparative advantage, whether it's undersea, space, and cyber. I think we need to be thinking differently about how we spend on defense. But I also think, more importantly, and I say this as a defense official again, that what we do to invest in the American people is going to be more significant in terms of competition with China than anything we spend on national defense.
Okay, and finally, I'd like to, whoever would care to answer, talk about the Uyghurs. Randy Shriver, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia, called the flagrant human rights abuses in Xinjiang concentration camps. He said there are at least 1 million, possibly as many as 3 million Uyghur Muslims who have been arbitrarily detained in recent months. What should we be doing to address this crisis, and why have we not seen more leaders of Muslim-majority countries condemning China's rights abuses in Xinjiang? Anyone care to do it? Dr. Friedberg, would you care to do that?
Well, I think what we're learning about what China is doing to its Uyghur population should...
Hold the microphone, please.
What we've been learning about what China is doing to its Uyghur population should shock the conscience of democratic societies everywhere. I think we've begun to do more to call attention to this and note that a lot of the initial efforts to uncover what was going on were not done by government agencies, but by private scholars and think tanks and so on. And that suggests, I think, one of the valuable roles that independent analysts can play in shaping our responses to what China is doing. I think there has to be or there should be a collective response from democratic societies in particular to this. There's, I think, an anxiety on the part of many governments about speaking out too strongly because China now wields considerable leverage through the threat of loss of access to its markets. As far as the response from the Islamic countries, I think there too, I don't know in detail, but many of the oil-producing countries have strong interests in commercial relations with China, and the Chinese have been very effective in threatening and silencing people into not criticizing them. But this is something that we should be focused on really day in and day out, because in my view it reveals something important about the true character of this regime.
Thank you, and very, very quickly, Dr. Economy, do you concur?
Yeah, very quickly. So I would say Congress already has pushed forward with the, looking at the Magnitsky Act. I think we need Secretary Pompeo, President Trump to raise this issue because they're not, near as I can tell. Europe is looking for potential areas of cooperation with the United States on this issue. This is someplace where Congress maybe should, again, take the lead with European allies. I will say there's evidence that if you publicize companies that are doing business in Xinjiang, even Chinese companies like Sensitime has pulled out of a venture. It was very active in the AI facial recognition area, pulled its stakes out. I think it was worried about being embarrassed publicly. And then finally, I think to Aaron's point, if we don't have a strong economic pillar engaged globally, then we're not able to compete with the kind of economic leverage that China exerts over other countries. And that's why you're not seeing that, that output from the other Muslim countries.
Thank you very much. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When the chairman and I met with Secretary Pompeo last week, he said that China is a primary threat to the United States. FBI Director Wray testified at Aspen, or spoke at Aspen, saying that it's the most significant threat that we face as a country. And the President's national security strategy named China as a top challenge in the modern era. As we traveled to Latin America, and I was in Africa as well, China's everywhere. I mean, they are this predatory lending practice, one belt, one road. It was amazing. It popped up in El Salvador, it popped up in Colombia, it popped up in Rwanda, all throughout the continent of Africa, the Western Hemisphere. They can take ports like Sri Lanka They can have a port in Djibouti right next to our military base without one shot being fired. So that, to me, is, how do you compete with that? And we passed a bill yesterday that tries to advance our mission in the State Department across the world to advance American businesses through diplomacy. But then on the technology side, Ms. Sachs, you talked a little bit about this as well. I worry about the competition on the technology side, the technology transfers, the theft of intellectual property. So I look at the four main areas: artificial intelligence you spoke to, quantum computing. We haven't talked much about that today, but that is going to be the next race for the nuclear digital bomb, if you will. Whoever gets there first will control. Of course, cyber. And then 5G. 5G. Everywhere, every country we went to, China was opening Huawei up to 5G in these countries. And as all four of you know, when 5G goes in, they control all the data. But the problem is, can we compete with their 5G? Are Verizon's and AT&T's competitive enough to compete with their 5G? So this is a worldwide competition, as I see it. We talk a little bit about collaboration, and that sounds nice, but we're dealing with with a country that likes to steal things and not invent necessarily. So and I know this is kind of a broad-based question, but that's just sort of the way I see China today. And when I have the top national security experts tell me it's the biggest threat we face, it used to be Islamist terror. When I get my threat briefings when I was chairman of Homeland Security, that was it. Now they're saying it's China. So that speaks volumes, I think, in terms of the threat level. And I'd just like to go down the panel if there are any comments.
So I think you make the really important point that what we see China doing at home, right? If we're looking at things like the development of its internet policies, the way that it's developed in terms of its own economic development, if we're looking at human rights practices, it is now exporting those to all the countries that you mentioned, right, through the Belt and Road Initiative. Belt and Road Initiative began as an infrastructure plan. It's moved to a digital Belt and Road, fiber optic cables, e-commerce, and satellite systems. There is a security component, as you mentioned, with the ports. China is training officials in Tanzania and Uganda on how to manage the internet, how to do online monitoring. It is exporting political capacity building for authoritarianism. And it's doing it at the global level in terms of global governance, right? So the same values that we see China at home, China exporting to other countries, it's also negotiating those, right, in the United Nations, and we're holding negotiations around things like internet governance. So how do we address it? Again, we have to have our own proactive and positive policy and message, right? And we can't do it alone. We're going to have to do it with our allies. It cannot be about condemning the Belt and Road. You can't go to Rwanda and just say, don't do this, right? We have to provide an alternative. One last point that I made in my written testimony I think bears mentioning, and that is that we do invest more in many parts of the world than China does, right? Even not just stock investment, but even investment 2 or last year. And we need to shape that narrative a little bit better than we do.
I think we have to offer a better alternative. I mean, they're offering a product. We have to compete with them. Ms. Sachs?
I agree with Ms. Magsamen that we cannot have a purely defensive strategy. We have to be able to compete. And so let's talk about 5G for a moment. The U.S. has no viable alternative to Huawei, and we can talk about why that is, but at this point, it is simply too late. This is a decade-long process. So how can we look forward and make sure that that doesn't happen again? I think about companies like semiconductor companies that are in China right now. A lot of the profit that comes from that market in China is then plowed back into R&D in emerging technologies like 5G. So it's not just as simple as let's get out of China. We need that as part of our own innovation base, which underpins U.S. power. The other issue is on the resources and the role that we give cyber within our own government. Shortly after Xi Jinping took power, he set up an office which has become one of the most powerful organizations in the Chinese bureaucracy, focused specifically on cyber. Meanwhile, we have sort of struggled to have our own, we don't have an equivalent of the Cyberspace Administration of China in our own government, and in the State Department, the cyber coordinator position has been in flux. So we need to make sure that we are matching toe-to-toe toe with the investment from the resources on the cyber front because their attacks are becoming increasingly sophisticated. So again, the fundamental point here is defense is not the only way to go about this.
Ms. Magnuson.
With respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, I do think it's important to distinguish between China's activities that are actually potentially good in terms of regional development, for example, like China building a road in Africa may be something that's in our interests as well. So I think we need to be selective about where we decide to compete with the Chinese on the Belt and Road. I also think that the biggest weapon that we can yield with respect to China's economic engagement is transparency. Working with regional platforms to establish transparency around these deals, because once you have that transparency, China tends to change its own behavior in terms of what it's offering. So if a country knows a deal is a bad deal, they're not going to pursue it with the Chinese. So I think a part of it's transparency and part of it's offering an alternative, but being selective about how we do that. On the tech side, on 5G, one immediate idea on 5G would be to try to pursue a digital trade union with the European Union and Five Eyes. I think that the Europeans in particular and many of our Asian allies are looking for the United States to offer that kind of leadership where we try to marshal a collective union around that. Now that's going to require some trade-offs from the United States, potentially around privacy rights with the European Union, but I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be doing in the immediate term with the Europeans.
I think the 5G for Five Eyes in the EU is a great idea. My time is way expired, but if you have just a very quick comment, Dr. Friedman.
It's just two very brief. On Belt and Road, I agree about being selective, the necessity of being selective, and as I said in my remarks, part of the reason for that is there may be positive effects from what China is doing, but there are also negative effects for China, which we shouldn't be protecting them against. I also agree that transparency is critically important. And here, too, NGOs and scholars and others have played a very important role in bringing to light some of the harmful effects of Chinese investment. And that's something, for example, the National Endowment for Democracy and the International Republican Institute here in the United States have played a role in and deserve congressional support. The technological competition is obviously a huge subject. I would just say I think we are headed towards some degree of decoupling and disengagement between our economy and China's, particularly in the high technology areas. That's already underway. It's really initiated first and foremost by things that China has been doing for some time. We are now trying to figure out how to respond. The question, in my view, is not whether we're going to do that, but how far and how fast it's going to unfold and how we can shape it to better serve our interests. There's a lot more to be said there, obviously.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sherman.
I join the chair in regretting the shameful lack of comment from Muslim countries about the oppressors of the Uyghurs. Only Turkey has spoken, and that is only because the Turkish opposition party shamed the government into it because the Uyghurs are not only Muslim, but also Turkic. Every other Muslim country has cowered toward China. They don't cower toward the United States. They're free to criticize us and often do. I join with the ranking member in support of his bill, which we passed to have the State Department push America's economic goals abroad. I would share with you just how long a distance we have to go in changing the culture there. Ironically, our top diplomatic schools are dominated by those with the attitudes of Confucian scholars toward the messiness of business and trade. In one instance, I'll only remember we had before my subcommittee one of the top diplomats in America who, in response to a question, said yes, he did do something to support American jobs. He supported the sale in his country, in the country represented, of the Chrysler Crossfire, which is 99% made in Germany. Not a mistake this diplomat would have made about anything he cared about. The WTO was not a risk, it was a blunder. 65% of the Democratic caucus voted no. 3.4 million jobs is what we've lost as a result of this blunder, according to the Economic Policy Institute. And today we have a president who at least is trying to do something about it. The reaction in my party is natural. We call it Trump derangement syndrome. It is that we must reverse our position if Trump is anywhere close to where we have always been. I hope he does not tweet something in favor of Mother's Day. There will be pressure on me to come out against mothers. The fact is, we were right then, we were right now. We shouldn't abandon our economic values and join the U.S. Chamber of Commerce just so we can be the opposite of Trump. And we've got to be aware that Wall Street funds most of the economic institutes in this country, who then confer legitimacy on an ideology that is pro-Wall Street and anti-jobs. One quick dovish statement: the islets in the South China Sea, there's no oil there, and if there was, it wouldn't be ours. There's no people living there. Trillions of dollars worth of trade sails by there because it goes in and out of Chinese ports, and this would give the Chinese the capacity to blockade their own ports. It is not an excuse to tremendously increase the aggressiveness and funding of the U.S. Navy. People on this panel came of age during the last parts of China's great century of weakness, but we've got to remember that's an anomalous period. For millennia, China has been the hegemon in its whole world. Then its whole world was East Asia. Now its whole world is the world. In the history of Rome, when a Roman leader made a political mistake and was on the wrong side, that Roman leader would get into a warm bath with wine and luxuries, soft music, and they'd open their veins. And they would relax in comfort for a wonderful hour. We are at that hour. We are comfortable, surrounded by luxuries and $600 billion worth of goods more than we actually produce. That's our trade deficit. We hear the soft music of economists telling us not to worry about the trade deficit, and in an hour, we'll expire. We're eyeball to eyeball with China, and in the Chinese view, they are going to win. They know they have the weaker economy. They are dependent upon American markets far more than we're dependent on them. They think they'll win because their political system is stronger. They believe that if they lose $1 trillion in GDP and we lose $1 billion in GDP, we will fold. That they have the unity and patriotism to persevere, and that we have division, self-interest, and no willingness to endure even the slightest pain to achieve victory. We don't need to wage a trade war against China, but we have to be prepared to win a trade war against China. We will avoid that war and win if China thinks we will win. They now think we would lose. We can't win a trade war with China if we don't have a plan to deal with a sharp decline in Sino-U.S. trade. They have a plan, we don't. Virtually no U.S. corporation has a plan to deal with the temporary cutoff in Chinese trade. That's a level of corporate malfeasance that I'm not sure their errors and omissions policies will cover from shareholder lawsuits. And in my own hometown newspaper, the headline is, "Trump Trade War Hurts American Consumers." We're either going to endure a little bit of pain now, or we're going to bleed to death slowly with unsustainable trade deficits. We had a question in here somewhere. I will say that we're going to have subcommittee hearings on this afternoon. Everyone on the committee is invited, and you may actually see me ask a question. I promise it will happen. If I had more time, I would ask the panel and maybe they just respond. Obviously, zero trade would be balanced trade with China. Is there any other approach that would get a zero trade balance with China in the next decade? I don't know if we have time for that, or they should respond for the record. Once my colleague asked me, what's the question? Are you aware of any plan other than a complete end of trade with China that would get us to a zero trade deficit within 10 years?
I'll answer the question because I think it's, unfortunately, the answer is no. I mean, it's a simple answer. I don't think that the trade deficit with China is the principal manifestation of our problems with them. I mean, I think the administration is trying to address that by pressuring China to buy more products from the United States. I don't think that's a long-term solution to our deeper problems with them, which have to do with the structural industrial policies and technology promotion policies that they're pursuing, we've thought that by including them in the WTO, we would encourage them to become more like advanced market economies. They haven't, as you've noted.
If I can interrupt, the trade deficit increase has cost us 3.4 million jobs, according to the Economic Policy Institute. That doesn't matter to people in Washington, doesn't matter to people at think tanks, but it got Donald Trump elected, and I think it matters to the country. I'll yield back.
Can I
Thank
just
you,
say
Mr.
that
Sherman. Oh, did
Sorry.
someone?
Can I just say, I think
Sure.
it does matter to people in think tanks, actually, and but I don't think that the zero trade balance deficit is the issue at hand, right? We're going to have trade deficits with countries all the time. The issue
no,
is whether or not
actually, we
China
should-
is playing on whether we have a fair and open playing field, right? The way that we
What
do with
matters
other
to
countries. That's the
people
issue.
is whether they lose their jobs, get addicted to opiates, have all the health problems. They don't want to lose and be told, it's okay, you lost your job, but it's a fair system. The jobs matter, not just whether we meet the rules. But if the rules were fair, we would have those 3.4 billion jobs. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of our witnesses for being here today. And Dr. Economy, and then we'll go with each of you, the consequence of the UN sanctions that have been implemented against the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. China has been assisting, but is there sufficient assistance to make every effort to denuclearize the peninsula, the Korean Peninsula? Begin with Dr. Economy and each of you. What has been the level of cooperation in regard to the UN sanctions?
I think we had very strong cooperation initially, the strongest that I think we've ever had, over the past 2 years. But my understanding is that over the past 6, maybe 8 months or so, that there's been a little bit of a lessening of the sanctions, and that China and South Korea and Russia are all sort of agitating for a slightly different approach, where we sort of loosen the sanctions. And I think that we're already seeing Chinese workers, North Korean workers back in China, back in Russia, with the ability to repatriate profits, et cetera. So I think we're seeing over time that there's been a relaxation in some areas of the sanctions.
Ms. Sachs.
This is outside of my field of expertise, so I'll defer.
I would agree with Dr. Economy. I mean, China uses its economic leverage with North Korea as a means to get to a political end. And they tend to toggle it back and forth depending on the circumstances of the situation, where diplomacy stands, whether they're doing missile tests. So right now I would agree with Dr. Economy. They are in the loosening phase because I think they're trying to get Kim Jong-un to actually engage diplomatically with the United States. So they kind of go back and forth.
Thank you.
Add that this is something they've been doing for a long time. And generally, I think the pattern has been when the Chinese leadership feels under pressure, particularly from us, or becomes more concerned about what the North Koreans are doing, they'll ratchet up sanctions, at least for a time. If they are less concerned, they'll draw back. I don't think they have any intention or ever will do all that they could to put maximum economic pressure on the North Korean regime because they are afraid that it would collapse. Unfortunately, I think it's only if the regime were put in a life-or-death position that there's any chance they would give up their nuclear weapons. So I don't think we can count on China to solve this problem for us.
And beginning with Dr. Friedberg and going the reverse direction, and that is, Congressman Sherman's already referenced it, but the artificial islands, which have now been converted to military outposts, the implications on that is to maritime trade.
Yes, I hesitate to do this, but I disagree with Congressman Sherman on this issue. I think the islands in the South China Sea are actually quite significant in a number of ways. They enable China to better maintain a year-round, 24-hour-a-day naval and air presence over these waters that they claim. And at some point, potentially, if we don't oppose them in a satisfactory way, to constrict the use of this vital waterway by other countries, principally allies of ours, as well as our own shipping. So that's a major concern. I think the second issue here is that by doing what they've done, since 2014 and getting away with it effectively, I think they've succeeded in raising serious questions about our resolve and our capacity to oppose their expansion. And I think that was part of the point, to demonstrate our inability to act effectively.
So I think the South China Sea threat is less about the commercial shipping lanes and more about sort of pushing the American military further out. You know, those islands allow them to project power in ways they couldn't before, for example, to what Dr. Freeberg said. And they also use that as a way to undermine confidence in America's resolve and ability, and they use it politically as well in the region, in particular with the Philippines and other countries. So China's objectives in this space are less about restricting commercial shipping and more about undermining the confidence in the United States' security guarantees.
I would only add that I think it's stage one, and stage two is looking toward Taiwan. So I think, you know, at every sort of level, we need to be pushing back in ways that seek to demonstrate that the United States does have the resolve to prevent China from moving forward in this way.
And thank each of you for your responses, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Sires.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. First, I'd like to agree with the ranking member's comments regarding the technology. And I'll just share experience that I had last month. In my district, I have Stevens Institute of Technology, which is a very fine institution. And they had been asking me for a long time to visit because they're doing some wonderful things, good research. So I went, and they were explaining some of the research that they just started on quantum physics. Well, I'm still trying to learn what quantum physics is. But what was really telling to me was that the person that was in charge of the research was Chinese. Of the 10 students doing the research, working with the professor, 9 were Chinese. There was only 1 American. Now, Stevens Institute of Technology does also a lot of defense work. My concern is how to deal with the fact that we don't get enough Americans into some of this research in some of these areas. Why should we have an institution like a Stevens Institute that is one of the finest institutions in America, and yet we don't have enough? And it's not because they're not trying. So can you talk a little bit about some of what I just said? Ms. Sachs?
So colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania recently wrote an excellent op-ed in which they described a mismatch between what our declared national intelligence priorities are, focusing on quantum, 5G, and AI, and where investment in public funding is going. So I think the first thing is we need to make sure that we're investing in basic research in these areas.
Yeah, but
Excuse me, I'm not finished. The second issue is that there needs to be incentives to have Chinese researchers and scientists who are working in our labs and universities stay here. I think when we don't provide the right environment for them, if they feel targeted here, they will go back to China. And so we want our universities, which are the best in the world, to continue to attract the best from around the world, but have them stay here and contribute to the U.S. economy. The third is in terms of STEM graduates and making sure that we're investing in that area as well. I also think that there needs to be more of a focus on inclusivity in that field. There's been a lot of focus on how can we better make a cyber workforce, for example, that's representative both from a gender perspective and others. So there's a lot of focus, and this plays back into the idea of it's not just playing defense, but thinking really strategically in an offensive way about investing in our own capabilities in these fields.
So how do we recruit people that are from this country to take some of these courses?
That's probably a good idea.
Oh, thanks.
Can I just
Yeah.
ask, it seems to me, if I remember Stevens Institute of Technology, that it's often been a very welcoming place for first-generation immigrants to come and be educated, right?
Jersey. That's because it's in Hoboken, New Jersey, and Hoboken has been an entryway into America for over 200 years, whatever.
Right,
forever.
so in that context.
And the birthplace of Frank Sinatra.
That's right.
Even more importantly. But in that context, I think Sam's point is well taken, that perhaps these are Chinese who should be welcomed, and thought about in terms of development and granting
It's not that
citizenship.
I'm welcoming them. I just want more participation from our students. It's not that I'm welcoming them. And concerned of the fact that 9 out of 10, and then, I went to another section of the college, and it was very similar.
Right.
There were some of the students from India, doing most of the research. So I'm interested in getting our kids, and I'm wondering it's because of the cost that is prohibitive, because Stevens is not, whether that's a factor. I want our kids, our good kids, to participate. And interacting with students. I was a teacher for 10 years, okay? And my wife for 37 years. Interacting with students helps a great deal in understanding each other's country. But it cannot be so one-sided. That's my concern.
So I completely agree, and I think part of this challenge is that Chinese students often pay full tuition to many of these universities, and so there's an economic incentive for these universities to seek Chinese students and sort of invest in them. I do think that there has to be some investment in postgraduate science education, some tuition assistance for American students so that we can continue to have a pipeline of American scientists and researchers. So I do think that part of the answer is actually some level of tuition assistance for American students. But this gets back to the original point I made earlier. We need to be thinking about our human capital in this country in a different way than we thought about it before. We need to be making moonshot investments in science education and postgraduate education in ways that get the American people competitive again. And have them, or they're able to actually get into the pipeline of competition. And until we take those steps and think strategically about this in the context of China, we're going to be behind the 8 ball.
Thank you. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panelists being here. China again. We've seen a rising China in the last, I guess, 40 years, but most recently in the last 10 years. And, I know you guys know the history real well, but if we go back to, just start with Mao Zedong, when he claimed in 1949 the chairmanship of the Chinese Communist Party after they fought the Civil War and ran the KMT out, that formed Taiwan. And since then, he put a vision of 100 years of where China would be. It's estimated that under his authoritarian rule, 80 million Chinese died. And I think you guys were talking about something that I hear over and over again. It was one of the reasons I ran for Congress, a lack of vision, a lack of leadership for America. We sit up here and we squabble over social issues, we squabble over, border security, we squabble over these things, but you don't hear one politician, one leader of this country of where America is going to be 100 years from now. And I'm guilty of that myself. And so we need to raise our bar. You were talking about education. Have we not dumped a lot of money into education? But we're not going in a direction. We just throw money into it without a vision. And until we have a vision of this country, we're going to have our clocks cleaned, as we see by China. China entered into the modern world in the 70s. And since that time, since Mao Zedong, they're 70 years into the 100-year plan, and they have done remarkable. We should be envious. And I applaud them for their success, and I want them to be successful, but not at the expense of us or other nations. Competition is good, but not to the point where it inflicts damage on another economy, another way of life. And then we have Deng Xiaoping in the 80s said, bide your time, hide your strength, and they did. They cornered the rare earth metals market in the world. And I'm sure you guys are aware our F-35s, 10% of the weight is rare earth metals. 90% of that comes directly from China. The other 10% come from countries that get it from China. Does anybody see a problem here? And now we have Xi Jinping, who has declared himself or voted in fair elections, I'm sure, in the Emperor for Life for China in the 17th Chinese Communist Party Congress in October of 2017. He said, "The era of China has arrived. No longer will China be made to swallow their interests around the world. It's time for China to take the world center stage." We've seen what they've done in the South China Sea. When Xi Jinping was here in the Rose Garden with President Obama, said we will not militarize those islands, yet today they have airstrips, military barracks, military offensive and defensive weapons, and radar systems. And they do have a lighthouse, they claim, that is for peaceful navigational purposes. We see them making claims to the Arctic Circle. And the international standard, as it was in the South China Sea, that is, if you don't have land touching those areas, you don't have any claim to it. China was sued by the Philippines and lost that lawsuit, yet they continue to build and militarize these islands. They're going to do the same in the Arctic. There's a saying, I don't know who gets credit for it, but it says, if you want to know the past, look at your present. If you want to know the future, look at your present activity. I think it's very clear what China's doing. You know, I wish we could say, man, they're great players. We want to invite them over for lunch and dinner and let our kids play with them. But we see them infiltrating our universities. They steal intellectual property from corn seeds to computer technology. Huawei came to my university and wanted to fund 100% a cybersecurity program, which we nixed and said, I don't believe so. And this is something, you know, I wish we could be we're already naive, but not stupid. You know, they have an aggressive path forward, and their goal is to build 5 new deep water aircraft carriers by 2030, and I bet they do. Yet we have fed this monster, I don't want to call him an enemy, we have fed this economy by allowing our manufacturers to go over there, and it's time for America to wake up. We need to have a policy called the ABC policy, anywhere but China for manufacturing. Our manufacturers need to get out of China and go anywhere but China. We don't want a head-on conflict with China. Nobody wants that in the world. And so the only way we can counter that is economically. And if we starve the economic engine, Xi Jinping will have to turn and adapt to the policies in the world. Am I wrong in that? Has anybody got a comment?
Just a general comment about our ability to compete effectively. I think historically, as a country, we've been slow and reluctant to engage ourselves, to mobilize our resources to engage in international competition. We've preferred to have a relatively weak government and to allow people to do the things that they want to do. What has tended to mobilize this country has been a shock, a setback, a crisis of some kind that galvanizes the American people and our leaders and gets people pointed in the same direction. And I worry that it may take that to mobilize us sufficiently to address this challenge, in part because the Chinese leadership has, I think, very intelligently sought to avoid giving us that Sputnik moment.
Right.
And they've been successful.
I'm going to cut you off because I'm out of time, but I do appreciate it, and I'd love to talk to you longer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Mr. Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As part of the Belt Road Initiative, China is investing massive sums of money in various countries, some of our allies. And of course, this money comes at a heavy price, right? And we have observed and heard from our allies about China's predatory loans that often lock these countries in years of debt. Could you share with us some of the predatory practices that they're putting in motion, that they're engaging some of these countries in that? For example, I know that in Ecuador, that was the case in several other countries in the Western Hemisphere and abroad and in Africa. What are some of the predatory practices that China engages in with regards to these loans? Anybody?
I think the challenge with the Chinese loans is, first that they're not transparently done. So we don't know whether, for example, there are deals being struck between Chinese companies and leaders of some of these countries where there are payoffs being made. There are issues around the fact that China exports its labor to do most of these projects so that people are not getting the benefits. So basically, they're getting the loans to do the projects, but the benefits are not being realized by the people of the country. There are the terms. In some cases, if the loans are not going to be repaid, China puts in the contracts that there will be payment through natural resources or perhaps even through, a port. Although in the Sri Lanka case, it's not clear. I've heard that the Sri Lankans actually offered up the port. It wasn't that it was built into the contract.
Evidence? Is there any evidence of corruption and bribery and?
Well, there are many, many cases. This is nothing new. Quite frankly, this goes back to 1999 when China began its go-out strategy for natural resources. The Belt and Road is simply an amplified version of that. I mean, in Zambia and other countries, elections have turned on the corruption that was inherent in Chinese dealings inside the country. So there's no problem coming up with cases of corruption at this point. I think the problem is really what is the alternative, right? And to that point, focusing on the transparency is one element of it, but the other element is, are we out there lending? And last point I'll make is that it's not actually a lot about investment. China only invests between $10 and $15 billion a year in these Belt and Road countries. Much more investment goes to Europe and goes to the United States, although not last year. But in any case, by far China was more interested in investing in the advanced industrialized economies. What it's doing is lending. So we should just change the terms of reference there.
China has further been investing in ports and coastal lands across the region. In fact, the chairman and I just visited El Salvador, and we were told by the incoming president that the past administration there was engaged in a deal to sell vast parts of its coastal territory. And additionally, in the Dominican Republic, China is attempting to purchase or construct a port infrastructure and a coal power plant. And they want to get their hands on the 911 system, which we help fund to implement facial recognition measures in it. What are your feelings regarding China and coastal projects, ports, and facial recognition in this hemisphere? Anyone?
Where are we?
Yeah, but we have an issue with fentanyl, right? Do you feel that the Chinese control of ports will further contribute to our opioid crisis here in the United States?
So the only point I'd offer is that there's always a duality in China's strategy with respect to economic engagement overseas. And you see that manifest itself, especially in the maritime space, where they do seek to have port contracts. Those are very strategic port contracts. It's about ensuring that they get, free flow of energy, but also there's a security dimension to that in terms of what they may do in terms of spying on the countries or seeing, for example, in Djibouti with our military base. So there's always a strategic dimension to much of what they do, especially in the maritime space.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I find it of great interest. Our witnesses, thank you for being here. Dr. Economy, you referenced a pipeline, and when you did, I thought about my district. I would wager we have the highest number of English-speaking students who speak Chinese as a second language as anywhere in the entire country. Our dual immersion programs really are exemplary, and there's a strong desire to understand and learn the Chinese culture. I myself speak passable Chinese. I've spent several years in the Orient. As the mayor of my city, before I came here, we had a sister city in China and spent a considerable amount of time with that mayor, learning and understanding that culture. When I was young, I think we tended to view China as what I would say dependent and needing our help. That changed along the way, and I think we started to view them as a friend. And somebody like maybe our NATO country friendships, we could both prosper from a mutually beneficial relationship. Somewhere along the line, that changed to a competitor. And since I've come to Congress, had a chance to travel and understand and learn a lot more, I'm questioning this term as competitor as well. When I think of a competitor, I think of a level playing field. I think of an officiator. I think of two teams going on the field and working and performing to the very best, walking off both better for their efforts. And so I've heard terms today like rival, I've heard adversary, I've heard primary threat, I've heard predatory, and it seems like all of you have kind of alluded to this frustration that we're not taking this serious enough or we're not doing enough. And I'm wondering if that's because we have not yet really defined what our relationship is with China, and if we're really ready to say some of the words that might truly define that relationship. So I'd like to put you all on the spot and ask you, are they an enemy? Are they an adversary? Are they a competitor? What exactly are they? And who would like to begin?
I think they're clearly a rival. They're competing with us across the board, economically, militarily, for political influence. As I indicated, I think their ultimate objective or their hope is to displace the United States, not only as the preponderant power in East Asia, but as the dominant power in the international system.
So can I freeze that comment for just a minute, because that is very aggressive, and that is far more than a competitor. That is an adversary.
That's my view.
Okay.
I'll offer the more nuanced view. I actually think China is a rival in the context of the Asia-Pacific. I think their aims there are more clearly defined in terms of trying to push the United States out from a security and political and economic dimension. I think global ambitions with China, I think, are still somewhat of an open question, but I do think that they're taking steps to put themselves in the strongest position possible to take us on at the global level.
So interestingly, if we go back to the sports analogy, a rival tends to infer a heated, our rival across town, right, is usually the one that we hate to lose to. We sometimes cheat, right? And so to me, is it fair to say that rival is a step beyond a competitor?
I sort of see that it's very similar, but potentially.
Right. Well, you mentioned that you were going to nuance it, and you did do that.
Yeah. So, but I do think that I think that for China, its global aims, I think, are a lot less defined than maybe they're being portrayed in this hearing. I think their regional aims are much more clear, and I think that's a place where we're going to have more significant challenges.
And Ms. Sachs, before you comment, I might also try to bifurcate the Chinese people from the Chinese leadership, and I want to be careful. I think we find the Chinese people are friends and want to feel that way about them, but it's the leadership that perhaps falls into this category.
And I really appreciate that comment. It's very important. I would add the term interconnected, whether you choose competitor or rival. So I think they are an interconnected competitor or rival with us, in which, from a security but also from a competitive and innovation standpoint, that interdependence is not going away and has to be a core part of our approach.
And Dr. Economy, before I run out of time, let me have you comment, but also perhaps the question I have in my mind that I at least want to ask, if we don't have time to answer it, is what they're doing sustainable? I've been over there, I've seen the empty cities, right? I mean, it just doesn't seem sustainable to me, and that would be my second question.
Very quickly, I would tend toward the adversary element and rival, and I think actually their aims on the global level are fairly clear. Xi Jinping has said that he wants China to lead in the reform of global governance, and that means changing norms and institutions in ways that reflect Chinese values, policies, and priorities. So I think we need to pay attention to what he says, because what he says is what he does. Is it sustainable? You know, we've waited a long time to see the Chinese economy collapse. It hasn't done that, but I think there are so many pressures there. I think it is in for a sustained economic slowdown over the long term, and I think there are a number of pressures, and we should always be alert to the potential that one day we're going to wake up and Xi Jinping isn't there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I'm out of town because out of time. I'd love to explore that more, perhaps the next time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you very much, Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Chairman, may I yield to Mr. Levin, who has to leave in a moment? I'll go after.
Yes, he was next, but you can switch. That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks, Mr. Phillips. I really appreciate you all being here, and I just want to tell you, I want to focus my questions on Tibet, actually, but Yesterday, I introduced the Advancing International and Foreign Language Education Act with my senior colleagues, David Price of North Carolina and Susan Davis of California. I'm the kid of the trio, but I just want to emphasize our commitment. A lot of you have mentioned the importance of this. It comes from personal experience for me. I spent a year in India during my undergraduate days and studied Asian languages and cultures as a graduate student at University of Michigan. And my wife was an East Asian Studies major and spent a year in China in like 1984, 5'10", strawberry blonde, teaching English in Hangzhou at an engineering university. You can imagine how she stood out. I think you all have an idea of what it was like in those days. But I do want to ask you about Tibet. The Chinese government maintains that it alone will decide whether and in whom the Dalai Lama will reincarnate, even though His Holiness has implied he may not reincarnate at all, and has rejected Chinese assertions that they have a role to play here, and it's a religious matter, essentially. As foreign policy fittingly reported earlier this year, China will no doubt anoint some successor to the Dalai Lama, and Tibetans will no doubt reject that person's legitimacy. Dr. Economy, if this scenario plays out, what will it mean for Tibetans in China and outside?
I think Tibet is already under so much pressure. Of course, this would be a devastating blow to Tibet and to the Tibetan culture. And I think we see what's happening in Xinjiang. And Tibet was both the precursor, but also could become now more like Xinjiang in terms of the level of repression and surveillance. So I think it's devastating, frankly. And how we give voice, I think, is difficult. One thought that I have had is that, the Vatican, for example, has become very active in negotiations and discussions with the Chinese government. It seems to me that, the Pope and other religious leaders should actually stand up and take a more active role in talking to China about the religious and cultural aspects of Chinese repression. We can do some things, but I think there are other actors that also have a different kind of legitimate voice in this.
Thank you. Well, let's follow up on the Xinjiang connection. I mean, as you know, the Chinese created the Tibet Autonomous Region. It didn't cover all of Tibet. Kham, as the Tibetans say, is in Sichuan and Gansu provinces, and Amdo, much of Amdo was in Xinjiang, and there are a lot of Tibetan people there. The architect of the security policy of forced assimilation in Xinjiang, Chen Shuangguo, used to be the party secretary in Tibet. And during his tenure there, he installed roughly 700 convenience police stations and divided urban centers into grids to better surveil all activities. And we now see similar tactics, as you mentioned, being used more intensively in Xinjiang. So I wonder if you or others on the panel want to comment on this, and is it likely that these so-called improved surveillance tactics will go back into Tibet from Xinjiang and be introduced in other parts of China as well?
So the way that technology is being deployed in Xinjiang as part of tracking, surveillance, and incarceration is deeply worrying. I think that there are open questions about the extent to which this will remain in Xinjiang or expand further. Regardless, this is a moment where, as Dr. Economy has mentioned, it's very important for U.S. businesses and investors that are in China to take stock of what are direct relationships between what's going on there or not. Sometimes those lines are very clear. When Thermo Fisher, for example, decided to stop selling DNA sequencers, sometimes it's very difficult. I've heard companies talk about the fact that there are very intense internal conversations going on, but how do you figure out what's an end user? What is an end use case in an expansive global supply chain? So this is a conversation that needs to happen, whether it's through an international standards body, whether it's through targeted export controls, but the conversation needs to begin.
Well, thank you, Mike. Oh, do you want to make a comment?
Just quickly, it seems that Xinjiang is something of a test bed for these surveillance technologies, and my understanding is including DNA, widespread DNA sampling. I would expect that those techniques would be applied elsewhere if they're successful, and if the regime feels that it hasn't really paid much of a price for doing what it's doing. And right now, it doesn't appear that they have that concern.
Thank you. Well, my time's expired, but we'll have to talk about this much more going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members, I read your all's limited biographies, and I think we ought to be sitting down here, and you all ought to be sitting up here asking us questions. Very impressive panel, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for assembling it. I had some really nice questions, but most of them have already been asked. But I guess what keeps going through my mind is it's almost like we have this parasitic role with China. They don't want to kill us off, but they just keep us alive, and then they just keep bleeding us. And my question to you all in my East Tennessee candor is, are they exploiting our stupidity, or are they, or is it just our greed for some short-term gain that we just keep giving in to them? It just seems to me, you know, we get up here and we talk tough. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. But then we get a call from home saying, hey, don't do that. And then we back off. And the Chamber of Commerce, you know, I mean, I don't follow them at all, actually. I get a little disgusted sometimes. I think they sell us out for their short-term greed, and that ticks me off. And I'm wondering what your feelings are on that. And I'm sure your grammar will be a lot better than mine, but I apologize. This whole discussion angers me.
I think the Chinese are exploiting our openness. They're exploiting some sort of essential characteristics of our system. We encourage our companies to go make a profit. And
sure.
So I don't think we can fault individuals particularly, or individual companies or even sectors of the economy for doing the things that we've, as a country, encouraged them to do over the last 25 years. Having said that, I think we're at a point now where we have to re-examine all aspects of the economic component of our relationship, because there are portions of it that are undoubtedly beneficial for particular sectors of our economy and particular firms and individuals, but no longer serve our national interest. And coming back to this question of whether we made a mistake by trying to engage them economically, I mean, we did that, I think, in part because we believed that economic growth would lead inevitably to political liberalization. And at the time, it seemed like that was the wave of the future. This is in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. And that was very much in keeping also with our sort of deep beliefs about the way the world works and should work. But we have to come to terms with the fact now that that has not panned out in the way that we would hope.
Right. But it seems that's a worldwide phenomena almost. I mean, I was in Israel for 4 days, and we're flying over their deep port, and guess who's building it? Right. The Chinese. America didn't even bid on it. Right. You know, it just, we talked to the ambassador about that, and it's sort of like it just kind of slipped through. I mean, I don't get it. I just don't get it. I'm sorry.
The fact that they have so much money now to invest, the fact that their market is as big as it is, gives them an enormous amount of leverage, and they're becoming more, I think, strategic and aggressive in using that leverage.
Yeah, but you said that they go, our companies go over there, but I ride a motorcycle, I collect old bikes, and I've had a few Harleys in my life, and I studied the phenomena of Harley through their ups and downs, and you know, everybody was cheering that China was opening their market, but it was a joke if you looked at it. I mean, they'd let one have in one area, but it was only being sold to a certain class of people, and I mean, it was a complete marketing joke to me. And you know, but there again, Pavlov's dog, they ring the bell and we come salivating. I'm sorry. Go ahead, ma'am.
So I think that parasite is a very good way of describing what's happening.
Ma'am, you'll not get anywhere in this committee by complimenting me, I can assure you. The rest of the committee has just written you off.
But I think that the costs, I mean, basically, I think we're going through a new cost-benefit analysis of doing business with China. And the good news, I think, is that many in the American business community are experiencing the negative aspects of doing business in China. And I think the Chinese are placing requirements on the American business community that is actually unhelpful for them. And so the good news, I feel, is, you know, maybe 10 years ago, the American business community was all in on China. I don't know that that's the case anymore. I think they are feeling the restrictions and are making more strategic decisions.
Great.
I would just say quickly that, we have benefited from the economic relationship with China, of course, in terms of, import of low-cost goods. Our companies have benefited. Our IP brings a lot more money, to Apple from the iPhone than the Chinese make off of that. But I think Kelly's right. We're going through a rethink, and I think that's smart. I would only suggest that you give the U.S. Chamber another look, because they actually are taking a very tough position when it comes to China trade and investment.
I will just say briefly on the Chamber of Commerce, they should take a lesson from this panel here, as they regularly have experts speaking on issues and have what are called manels of all men. So the Chamber would be wise to observe the way that this committee has done this, with the exception of Dr. Economy.
I would say, and my time's up, I have to go, I would say if they were so great at what they are doing, they'd be out making money instead of sitting behind some desk driving a four-legged mahogany all day. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Thank you. Mr. Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to our witnesses. I want to go upstream and talk about education. If we don't start preparing our young people for the world that is and that will surely be, I believe hearings like this will be of little consequence. And I was pleased that you, Ms. Magsamen, talked about investing in our greatest strength, our people. You, Ms. Sachs, talked about investment in STEM education. I think it's fair to say that we still in the United States have the world's preeminent higher education system, as evidenced by over 350,000 Chinese students attending our universities at this very moment. But all the evidence indicates that we're falling behind relative to our primary and secondary education. Is there anything specifically we can learn from how the Chinese are preparing their young people that we might adopt in this country? Ms. Sachs?
When I go to China and I talk with graduates coming out of universities, we have a sort of conception that the Chinese state-owned enterprises are really what are fueling China's technological ambitions. The reality is there is a growing class of really savvy, hardworking entrepreneurs in Chinese private companies, and this is really what's at the forefront of innovation in these emerging technologies. It's an exciting, futuristic place to be. What can we learn from that? There's a saying in China, 996, that Chinese entrepreneurs and these sort of young people coming into startups are working from 9 to 9, 6 hours a day. And this is one of the things that potentially is making these startups so innovative in stuff like AI. And are there lessons to be learned in our own culture as we think about ways to approach these cutting edge fields?
Anything specifically in schools, primary and secondary schools, that the Chinese are, how they're preparing their children vis-a-vis how we are, relative to new technologies, STEM, any of you, of which you're aware?
I can get back to you on that. It's an excellent question.
I'd welcome it.
Yeah.
Okay. I also want to ask a question on fentanyl. It is now the cause of over 30,000 deaths in this country annually. That exceeds HIV, car crashes, and gun violence at their respective peaks. Of course, just last month, the Chinese agreed to ban fentanyl, which we hope will stem the flow into this country. A, do you believe that they will follow through on that commitment? And B, if not, what can and should we do to prevent the flow of one of the leading causes of death in the United States? Whoever wants to take it.
I would say that while the Chinese have made that commitment, it's going to be important for the most senior levels of this government, including members of Congress, to hold them accountable to that commitment aggressively, because I am not entirely convinced that they will actually implement that commitment. So part of it will be political level pressure that needs to be sustained, especially at the presidential level going forward. In terms of what to do about it afterwards, I think part of this challenge is also going to be, again, working with, and actually the Defense Department is very focused on this, and they did a report on it, looking at kind of maritime shipments and working on sort of like maritime transparency initiatives with other allies around the fentanyl trade as well.
Okay. Any other perspectives? Yes, Doctor. Oh.
I would be surprised, actually, if the Chinese regime is very successful in cutting this off, whether because of lack of commitment on their part or because it's a huge and complex economy and they probably don't attach very high priority to it, although I agree if we want to increase the odds that they will, we have to make clear to them that this is a top priority issue and keep coming back to it. I gather, I'm not an expert on this, but I gather that some of the measures that have been taken limiting the ability of companies to ship small packages into the United States at low cost actually will have an impact on at least one channel through which these chemicals come into the U.S. Okay. But undoubtedly, there will be others.
From a cultural perspective, what works relative to negotiating and prioritizing, especially when it comes to an issue like this? How do we make something that kills 30,000 people in this country annually the highest priority, or at least amongst them, with our Chinese counterparts?
It has to happen at the presidential level.
Okay.
Look, I think you have to identify interests within China that share the interests here. So, on climate change, that's how we got them to do something on climate change. There were already groups within China that were pressuring the government to do more. If that doesn't exist, I think the odds of them actually adhering to this kind of agreement are quite low. And what you're going to see is probably more exports going to Mexico, and then from Mexico coming into the United States. So, it will require a level of enforcement, I think, that is going to be quite extraordinary on our end.
Okay. Thank you all. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank the members of the panel for being here. Without being too overly simplistic, and I suspect this listening to what I have of Ms. Sachs' testimony, you're probably talking in my mind about if I can characterize it this way, the average Chinese person who in many cases loves America, wants to emulate America, and from my understanding, if you travel to China and just meet those folks, they're generally capitalistic and have a lot of Western values. But the context of the question is we're not dealing with those individuals on a decision-making level. We're dealing with the world that is, which is the Chinese government, the Chinese communist oppressive government. And so I think it starts out with how we characterize them. And I'm just wanting to get your take on China. Friend or foe, strategic adversary, ally, enemy, what do we characterize them as? And if you folks are confused, imagine how we feel. Anybody?
Well, we had a little bit of a back and forth on this, and at least I put my hand up supporting the term adversary, for lack of a better one. I think the point you started with, though, is an extremely important one, and a number of people have touched on it. The necessity of differentiating between the Chinese people, the Chinese nation and civilization with its long history, and the current Chinese regime, the Chinese Communist Party regime. When we have to be very clear when we talk about China that we were referring to the regime and not the Chinese people.
I would agree with you. There have been regimes throughout history where everybody in the country wasn't a part of or believed in the beliefs or the goals of the regime in charge, but yet still they were there, and the world had to deal with the reality of the regime in charge. And my point in making that is while there aren't many times, unfortunately, that I agree with my friends down on the other side of the aisle here, but particularly Mr. Sires when he talks about 9 out of 10 of the students were Chinese, or even my good friend from Sherman Oaks, and he talks about the jobs are important. I look at China and I wonder what they do that is in the United States' interest that is not more in their own interest. Everything they do is more in their interest. And while it's nice to have Chinese students here, and maybe they would stay, I'm not sure that that's in our interest if they're going to be collecting on us and sending that information, whether it's intellectual property or anything else, back to Mother China that's going to be, for all intents and purposes, in support of their mission. And so I guess my question to you is this. Right now we're in this, well, we've been involved in a trade war, and we finally have a president that has responded to the war, in my opinion. But I wonder about the difference that, as you see them, between sanctions and tariffs, because tariffs are a tool that don't have the stigma of sanctions, but I wonder how many times we have to watch China disrespect us, steal from us, and import opium. You name the list of infractions before we sanction, before we punish. Sanctions are punishments, right? Before we punish China. And is there appreciable difference to the American people, to the person that wants a job, the people in the Midwest that are suffering because of the tariffs, the people in the steel industry that To a certain extent, some are suffering if you're using steel, and some are winning if you're producing steel. So if anybody can talk about the difference between sanctions and tariffs and what is at stake for China and what is at stake for the United States in that regard.
I would just offer that, as far as I'm concerned, the tariffs are useful only insofar as they shocked the Chinese system, right, and shocked the Chinese leadership into understanding that this is a different administration with a different approach, right? This is not something that we should look to sustain over the long term because, you're right, it does harm our farmers and other actors in the United States. Sanctions are useful insofar as they target very specific acts of economic aggression, right? So when you have a Chinese, semiconductor company, right, looking to steal or stealing, attempting to steal from, Micron Technologies, then, we put the full force of the FBI and the Justice Department behind it, and we go after those companies, and maybe we bar them from, accessing other U.S. Materials and bar them from selling into the United States. So I think, to me, they're two very different things and should have two very different uses.
I would agree with you, and since I'm out of time, let me just ask you this. With everything that has happened, including North Korea's recent infractions, is it time now? I mean, I understand China's going to play long ball, and they wait dynasties where we have presidential cycles that run every 4 years. Is it time now to increase pressure on China with sanctions?
I'm sorry, you mean sanction China over North Korea?
Sanction China over numerous things, but the point is to increase the pressure using sanctions as opposed to tariffs.
Again, for me, I see sanctions as being, very targeted.
Okay.
Sort of applications for very targeted infractions.
Okay, so let's just say that the intellectual military property that was stolen from universities is evidenced in the Wall Street Journal article about a month ago. Should China be sanctioned for that?
I think the Chinese companies that participate in that, absolutely, we should find ways to.
And what about the government that sanctions their participation?
Yeah, I'd have to think more deeply about what kind of sanction could be imposed upon the Chinese government itself.
Okay, my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel. Just a word on the South China Sea issue and transitioning to the questions that I want to ask you. Your exchange earlier reminded me of a conversation that I had with our former colleague, Admiral Harris, when he was the commander of our forces in the Pacific, and we were talking about my job in the State Department, which was human rights, and his job, which was dealing with China and its incursions in the South China Sea, and we agreed that we were working on exactly the same issue, because in both cases what we were dealing with was China as a great power asserting that the rules did not apply to it, and that's really our interest, and in a sense we have an equivalent interest, whether it's trade, human rights, South China Sea, security, in asserting that the rules apply. And I think this is how we win our great power competition, by being the champion of those international rules that small and large countries around the world embrace. But let me focus in particular on the human rights issue and begin with the situation with the Uyghurs, exploring some practical possibilities. Dr. Economy, you mentioned that a number of large companies had begun to divest from relationships with Chinese companies involved in surveillance technology, for example, in Xinjiang. And that is indeed true, but there's still quite a few that have not. There are major American pension funds that are still invested in Chinese companies that are basically running the surveillance apparatus that is oppressing the Uyghurs. McKinsey held their retreat near Kashgar, which was quite unfortunate. There's a controversy surrounding Eric Prince's company, whether it is in fact involved in an enterprise, a training camp that would be situated there. So the question is, should we do something about this? Should the Congress look to legislation in this area? Should we, for example, require companies that are listed on American stock exchanges to disclose relationships with Chinese security services? Should we require the State Department to publish a list of problematic Chinese companies that are involved in state repression? and perhaps discourage, perhaps prohibit U.S. companies from engaging in business relationships with those companies, or other things along those lines for anybody on the panel?
It seems to me the answer is yes, we should. I don't know the exact mechanism for doing that, but why should we allow companies that are engaged in this kind of activity, to which we object for a variety of reasons, to operate freely in the United States? I don't see any reason why we shouldn't or couldn't do that kind of thing. I think there have been cases in the past where Congress has passed legislation that imposed similar limitations on American companies that were selling materials that could be used for surveillance or repression in other parts of the world. So there are models for that that could be applied to China as well.
So I would say yes, 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 and plus. I would add the plus being working with other democracies and our allies to do the same, so that we're not the only ones on the field doing that.
Good point. Thanks.
Absolutely. The challenge is going to be when there aren't direct collaborations. How do you assess this? So, for example, if you look at the top AI startups in China right now, a very high proportion of them are working with security firms that are involved with surveillance in Xinjiang. But again, this is inherently dual use. So I can have a conversation with a Chinese company that's working on AI for growing cucumbers, and then I can talk with someone about drones and sort of biometrics. So the trick is in those expansive supply chains, and you have US companies investing in broad AI incubation research centers in China, where do you draw those lines? And I think that's where the answer is a resounding yes, but then on these issues, it becomes very thorny to actually implement it.
Good. Well, we have four really smart panelists who agree that we should do it and that it might be complicated. I would love to get specific recommendations from all of you, and I think many of us would be interested in pursuing that. Second quick question. Reciprocity also seems to be an important principle that we can apply in advancing some of our interests and values. I remember from my time in the State Department, we had a problem that virtually every single public diplomacy activity that our embassies and consulates in China tried to undertake to reach out to the Chinese people was being blocked, sometimes hours or days before the scheduled event, and yet Chinese diplomats are completely free in the United States to conduct outreach in all 50 states. We're blocked from even traveling to some Chinese provinces. They are not in any way impeded from doing the same in the United States. Again, there are fine lines here. We don't want to mirror image bad behavior, but should we be more focused on reciprocity when it comes to public diplomacy, when it comes to Chinese media, quote unquote state media, having full access to the United States, but American journalists are denied visas to go to China? Should we get more serious about direct reciprocity?
On this one, I will say absolutely. It's something I've recommended across the board, that reciprocity has often been viewed as something that, it's lose-lose and leads to the lowest common denominator, and thus we don't want to practice it. We should set ourselves up as a model for the Chinese to emulate, but I think we're past that point. And so whether we're talking about, the media, or we're talking about Confucius Institutes and, American corners, or we're talking about visas, I think they all, reciprocity can be useful for all of them, with the caveat that we need to understand what our end game is in using reciprocity. And so for me, I look at this issue of the visas right now, where we've started to make it more difficult for some Chinese scholars to come to the United States. And I think the objective shouldn't be to prevent these Chinese scholars from coming to the United States. The objective should be to open the discussion with the Chinese government so that our scholars who've been banned or are having trouble getting to China, that the door opens to them. So, and I think the same is true across the board. Not banning Chinese TV just for the sake of banning Chinese TV, but for opening the door to American television content in China.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you. Mr. Friedberg, or Dr. Friedberg, I'd like to go to you first if I could, about Taiwan. Taiwan is not part of China. It has its own government, its own elections, its own military, its own courts. It has its own visas and passports that it issues. It borrows sovereign debt. It has its own central bank and its own currency. its own economy, its own trade relationships, its own national identity. It's never been part of the PRC, despite the fact that China likes to make people think that it was. It never has been, nor do the people of Taiwan want to be part of the PRC. The only thing that makes it different than any other normal country is that Beijing forces international organizations and other countries to treat it differently. Since Jimmy Carter switched diplomatic relations from Taiwan to China, Congress has been in an ongoing tug-of-war with the executive branch to get the State Department to treat Taiwan more like the country that it is. And I've been a long-time supporter of Taiwan. You could probably sense that from what I'm saying, and was one of the founding members of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, and I'm now one of the co-chairs of the caucus. Would you agree that giving excessive deference to Beijing's one China view and the way it looks at China is counter to our interests, to U.S. interests? And what else should the U.S. be doing to support one of our strongest allies, not only in the region, but really around the world? I look at them much as I do Israel, as far as a country that their interests and our interests are very, very similar, if not always the same, pretty close. So what more can we do to support this ally against the bullying tactics of one of our chief rivals, the PRC, China?
Well, I agree with your characterization. I think the measures that we have been taking and could take in greater, with more strength, include on the diplomatic front, being less concerned about the inevitable protests from the Chinese if we have contact with and dialogue with Taiwanese counterparts. I think we have to demonstrate to them that they have not so sensitized us that we're afraid of doing things that are within our sovereign rights as a country. And I think we're doing a bit more of that. To me, the part of the purpose of that is to signal to the Chinese, to the PRC, our continuing commitment to Taiwan. If we allow ourselves to be backed further and further away, I think we run the risk of encouraging the regime to think that in the end, we're really not going to support Taiwan. There are measures in the military domain, and we've continued to sell arms to them under the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act, and I think there's more that we could do. And in the economic realm, there may be opportunities for trade agreements of various kinds that would enable Taiwan to have even greater access to our economy and perhaps to limit the extent to which they're dependent on the mainland. This is going to be an ongoing struggle, and Dr. Economy mentioned, and I agree, that I think the longer term, or maybe not so long term objective of the current Chinese leadership is to, at some point, try to resolve this issue in their favor, and as they try to push us away and undermine the credibility of our commitments, their objective ultimately is to isolate Taiwan.
Thank you very much. And I've probably got time for just one more question. I'll throw it to either of the other three witnesses here, whoever wants to take it. Whether it's massive global infrastructure investments through the One Belt, One Road initiative, building artificial islands in the South China Sea and then militarizing them, cyber theft of technological and military secrets, the development of carrier killer missiles, or leveraging international organizations to advance its policies on Taiwan, as I just mentioned, to name but a few. Beijing's asymmetric strategies have often caught U.S. administrations pretty flat-footed. How do we need to change our thinking to counter these types of threats? It seems almost like the problem is systematic here. So whoever wants to take that on, I'm open to them. Dr. Economy?
So let me just say, I think it begins with paying attention to what Xi Jinping is saying and how his words are going to be translated into action, right? Because China often signals what it's going to be, what it plans to do. We shouldn't be getting caught off guard. Having said that, China's also very opportunistic. You know, when the Belt and Road started, it was an infrastructure plan. It was not the digital Belt and Road. It wasn't the polar Belt and Road. So there's a constant need to stay on top of what's being said, the policies that are being developed, and what we see being translated, you know, on the ground. Just on the Taiwan point, I would say quickly, I think two other things we could do. One is to engage Taiwan as we're thinking through our free and open Indo-Pacific projects, like the electrification of Papua New Guinea, right, that we're doing with New Zealand and Australia and Japan. Why not include Taiwan in that kind of endeavor? It's a way of opening up the international space for Taiwan as China's trying to close it. The second thing is I think we need to work with Europeans and other allies to ensure that our business community is not scrubbing Taiwan from all its sites, right? They don't want to do it. The pressure is intense. But if they're not faced with the competition, right, from the Europeans, American companies won't do it. So I think that's the second thing we should do.
Thank you very much. Excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Houlihan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you all for your wonderful testimony. My questions are for anybody who has input into them. My first one has to do with the UN and particularly China's influence in peacekeeping operations. We have obviously seen that China has been very active in peacekeeping operations, but has also in some cases undermined some of those operations in human rights and sexual trafficking or slave trafficking. And in 2014, we saw that China appeared to use the aspects of the UN for peacekeeping to their own benefit in the Sudan and protecting the workers in the oil industry there. And so although it would appear that they're more gracious with their time and with their resources, sometimes it's in their own self-interest. And so my question is, how can the U.S. ask China to contribute more in this way for the global good as opposed to for their own personal good or for their own state good? And how can we exert diplomatic pressure to achieve that?
So this comes back to, you know, as China's capabilities grow and they should be contributing more to the global public good, it's really important for the United States to be the one helping them set the standards for that contribution. And so when we lean out of whether it's climate change or peacekeeping or pick your global issue, China then has a lower bar to hit. So part of it is about us and how we engage in these spaces and how we push the Chinese just by the sheer fact of our participation in some of these agreements. That will be the most helpful, I think, in terms of this. You know, you use PKO. There's also global pandemic disease, where China is really not contributing at the level they need to be contributing at, and in fact, very much focused on their own interests in terms of domestic stability in the case of many of these pandemic issues. So I think basically the bottom line is we have to be we have to be present, we have to be leading in the standard setting, and we have to be marshaling our friends to push the Chinese as well.
Thank you. And in fact, this committee and the body as a whole just passed forward legislation that talked about exactly that with relation to the climate issue, and also asking our presence to be more felt and challenging our government to be more responsible from a diplomatic standpoint to issues of climate. And I think you're right. You know, we lead by example, and if we don't lead, there's a vacuum and the opportunity to sort of lower the standards. My second question is, again, for anyone, which has to do with a recent assessment that the Navy just published in their cyber readiness review, which says that they found the Department of Navy preparing to win a future kinetic battle while it is losing the current global counterforce, countervalue cyber war. I'm also a member of the Armed Services Committee, and I've heard testimony from the DoD regarding our need to invest in capabilities to respond to China's investment in emerging weapon and cyber technologies. And my question is, considering the size of our defense budget and our demonstrated priorities recently, in your assessment, are we maintaining our elite military status, or is China gaining ground?
As the former DoD person. Again, I think with respect to China, we need to be making investments in the domains that they're going to compete with us in. And, you know, frankly, more surface fleet is not going to win the day with respect to China. It's going to be about how we compete in the digital space, in the cyberspace, in outer space. And so it's really how we spend that money on defense that's going to be the most important. I feel like a broken record on this as a former DoD official, but the Congress has a role to play in pushing the services in particular, ma'am, on these issues because they want to just invest in legacy systems and legacy programs that, frankly, are the programs of the last century and not the programs of this century.
I'd just add on that,
please,
on
go
that
ahead.
point. I think what appears still to be lacking in this domain is an overarching strategy or concepts of operations for countering China's, especially their anti-access area denial capabilities, with all that that implies. And yet, as the recent report of the National Defense Strategy Commission points out, the Defense Department has not yet articulated those concepts. And here, I agree, I think Congress has an important role to play in holding the feet of the DoD to the fire to do that. Because going back now to the discussion of air-sea battle in 2011, we have, as a country, identified a serious strategic problem, called attention to it, and now not evidently found a solution to it. I know that we're working on it, but we need to be able to articulate to ourselves, to the Chinese, to our friends in the region, how it is that we're going to respond to their buildup, and we haven't yet done that.
Thank you. I've run out of time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Watkins.
Thank you to the panel for being here. The violations of intellectual property, are those perpetrated by non-state actors in China or just the government?
I mentioned earlier that I testified in March about the role that China's cybersecurity standards regime play in tech transfer and IP theft. And I want to highlight that because I think these will continue to be problems even if we get a trade deal. There are over 300 domestic cybersecurity standards in China, which as part of doing business require things like invasive source code reviews and other kinds of sensitive information. This is a channel for IP theft that has nothing to do with state actors or even joint ventures. It's something that I think is somewhat under the radar, but will continue to be an issue. So the answer is much beyond the state actor. It's the whole regulatory structure.
Can I just add that I think one step that the United States could take would be to require Chinese firms to disclose their ownership structure before they enter the U.S. market, in part because the distinction between state and private is not always as clear as it appears on the surface. So, when a Chinese citizen enters the United States, they have to provide 5 years of their residence on a form. We should be doing the same thing for Chinese companies in terms of exposing their ownership structure. It's not barring them, it's just imposing a level of transparency that we're currently not imposing.
Could I add also, going back to the discussion we had a few minutes ago about sanctions, if we're interested in deterring future theft, we have to impose costs on those who have been identified as engaging in theft. And that, to me, is one reason for using the tool of sanctions in a targeted way against companies, entities, where we can prove that they've been involved in theft of intellectual property.
In 2018, China published their Arctic policy, which painted a picture of their vision. Can anybody comment on what the U.S. should be doing? They have a pretty aggressive vision, particularly along the lines of trade routes, scientific research, I suppose. Any comments on that? If not, that's fine. I will yield the remainder of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Trone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to follow up on the comments by Congressman Phillips a bit ago about and reinforce his message. The CDC indicates over 70,000 Americans died last year, drug overdose. That's 192 every day. Significantly, these overdoses, deaths come from heroin, fentanyl, or other products that are laced with fentanyl. If you ask local stakeholders, it comes back to one word, it's fentanyl. So I had a meeting last week with Minister Zhu Wanzhou from the Chinese embassy, and I spoke to her and congratulated her about their commitment to list the fentanyl, but had a difficult time understanding exactly where they stood on enforcement. I couldn't get much clarity about how that was going to take place and how it might look. And I know you touched on that a bit, but I was very frustrated. So my first question would be for Ms. Sachs, how do we work with China to make sure they crack down on internet sales and that is a platform from spreading this drug.
I was about to say fentanyl is way outside my expertise, but the internet issue is interesting because China has one of the most comprehensive legal and regulatory regimes for cyberspace in the world. And I think I would advise maybe next time you have these conversations is to talk about ways that if there are areas of sort of black market sales or other things that are going on through China's digital economy, I would think that Chinese lawmakers and officials would have an interest in using some of those tools, not just to crack down on censoring content that's at odds with the CCP, but also things that could potentially be a constructive use of those government authorities over cyberspace.
We'll hope for the best. Given the local Chinese government, officials may benefit from the export of some of these materials because it helps drive local economic targets. What's your assessment of the potential to be successful in getting Chinese-U.S. cooperation in this space? Dr. Freeberg?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not optimistic about it for the reasons, some of which you've suggested in your second question. If there are parties in China, as there clearly are, that benefit from this process, even if people at the top of the regime want to shut it down, it'll be difficult to do. And that assumes that the people at the top are really taking it seriously. And I think, as your conversation suggests, there's some reason to question whether that is yet the case.
Do we have any sense of the dollars of impact it's coming out in 2018 of fentanyl? No one has any data whatsoever. Okay, great.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Conway, saw on page 3 of your written testimony, you talk a little bit about China's social credit system, which sounds very Orwellian to me, very Big Brother-ish. Could you please explain that just in a little more detail, please, ma'am?
Sure. The social credit system is an effort by the Chinese government to evaluate the political and economic trustworthiness of its own citizens. Right now, it's underway in about 40 different pilot projects, so there is no one national system. Different pilot projects use different sets of metrics, evaluate them on different things. Some of the ones that are common are whether or not you've repaid loans, right? Whether you're sort of a good citizen in terms of your financial standard, but it can be lots of other things. Did you participate in a protest, right? That could lower your social credit score. Did your friend Sam participate in a protest? That could also lower your social credit score. There's been talk of using things like, are you buying Chinese goods? Right? So if you buy Chinese goods as opposed to foreign goods, that could increase your social credit score. And then these scores are to be used, in a form for rewards and punishment, right? Punishment, maybe you don't get to board a high-speed train or a plane. A reward might be that you jump to the head of the line for your child at a prestigious school. So all of these things are under discussion, and as I said, different different parts of the country are doing different kinds of things. Even when it's a national program in 2020 and everybody has a social credit score, there's not going to be one uniform set of metrics. What's most troubling is the expansion of this social credit score to foreign actors, right? So the sort of assignment of a social credit score to multinationals, and I just heard recently to the leadership of these multinationals. I've only heard of one case of this, but I think this is very troubling. So assessing the sort of loyalty to China, in effect, for companies and for American and other heads of multinationals, I think is very problematic.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Sachs, question for you. In your written statement, you say on page 2, you talk a little bit about, and give me one moment here, that China is seeking to become a cyber superpower, and you talk a little bit about 5G, artificial intelligence. As we stand today, where do we stand where do our capacities stand as it relates to China? In the 60s, it sounded like we have the space race. It sounds like we may be moving into a technology race with the Chinese. And my question to you is, where do we stand in that race?
The first thing I would say is it's not a zero-sum game. So we have U.S. companies that are doing cutting-edge work in these fields, accessing talent from China, which feed into that innovation. So we have to think of these, again, as interconnected systems. In 5G, the reality is you have two struggling European companies, and then Huawei and the other Chinese telecom, ZTE. We missed the boat on that. So 5G is a real issue. On AI, I think that there is certainly cutting-edge work being done primarily by China's private sector in AI. But if you look at sort of the application of those companies beyond China, I'm a little bit skeptical of their ability to capture market share outside of China. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of having really, it's not just access to massive quantities of data to train AI algorithms, it's the math that's being done to that and what's being done at the sort of the postgraduate and advanced level. So it's close.
And how do you work with the Chinese, but at the same time keep the Chinese from stealing our technology? I think we've seen industrial espionage. I think we've seen the Chinese take American technology, use that in their military programs. And how do you have a working relationship with the Chinese, but on the other hand, make sure that we are protecting proprietary interests as it relates to things that are necessarily militarily important?
And so this is where I get to the concept of small yard, high fence, where we are selective about what we are protecting. The current list of emerging technologies that's been circulated by the Department of Commerce, frankly, I find it unhelpful. They gave industry a very short period of time to comment on it, and they're very broad, they're overly broad. So I think a framework needs to be developed for input from military, from commercial stakeholders who are even outside of the export control process, and to come up with more specific technologies and applications. It's also hard because we're talking about how do we predict technologies in the future, emerging technologies. We don't know yet what their use for national security is going to be. So to have a sort of negative list, that's overly broad, I think could shoot ourselves in the foot.
And one quick question for the panel. Recent media reports said that there appears to be a more modern Chinese aircraft carrier that is under construction, which would give them a third carrier group if they were able to deploy that. And I know our discussion has not necessarily been as it relates to military, but to the witnesses here, does that cause any of the witnesses concerns that they are continuing to expand their military?
So in some respects, China's growing economic power means it's going to naturally develop a more significant military. They have global economic interests that they themselves also want to protect. In terms of the aircraft carrier itself, I still feel confident that ours are better, and I think they have proved that recently. So, does it concern me that they're spending all this in massive military modernization? Yes, I think we should be attentive to what they're doing in that space. But I also think we need to be focusing more on what we are doing and the investments that we're making to ensure that we're actually going to maintain a competitive edge in the domains where we're actually going to compete with the Chinese. And I'm not as certain that it's going to be aircraft carrier on aircraft carrier.
Just very quickly, I think what's important about the further carrier development is as an indication of their intent and desire to be able to project power beyond the region on a global scale, something they're only beginning to do. We will see more of it. It's not shocking. We should expect it. We should think about how we will respond.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Allred.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our great panel. I've learned a lot reading your testimony and listening to you today. I was struck by the juxtaposition. I'm a new member of Congress here. I was sworn in during a shutdown, and while our government was shut down, the Chinese were landing a lander on the far side of the moon. And to me, it was kind of a perfect example of how some of our own internal squabbles, lack of domestic and foreign investment, have accelerated China's kind of rise to peer status in many areas. And so it was an interesting way to enter Congress. But one area, Dr. Economy, that I wanted to talk to you about to begin with that I find perplexing is what China is doing on the environment and with their efforts to combat pollution, but also some of the things they're doing that's going to contribute to their pollution outputs. And I want to ask, despite they're of course a member of the Paris Agreement, we are not. In this House, we have voted to try and rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. But I wonder if you could walk me through what you think the Chinese are thinking there and what kind of their strategic goals are.
Sure. So this is the first Chinese leadership, I would say, to take the environment seriously in China, and it's done so because the environment was really the largest source of social unrest in the country, just as this leadership was coming into power. So both online and in terms of actual massive demonstrations, you know, they were having 10, 15,000 people, you know, gather in the streets to protest the air quality. So I think they take it seriously. The response has been primarily to assuage the concerns of the upper middle class, the coastal provinces, the wealthier areas. So that's where the initial efforts have been targeted. We've seen that as the economy has slowed, they've stepped back from some of their environmental targets and timetables, right? It's because the economy is still more important to them than the environment. I think they see a technological advantage to be had, or an economic advantage to be had, from pushing forward very aggressively in renewable energies, you know, where they have captured the market, solar energy, wind, et cetera. So I think now they're going to do it with electric cars, right? They have more than 400 different electric car companies. They have the largest electric car market and electric car manufacturing capacity. So I think they see this as a big advantage for them moving into this space. At the same time, first, you know, their CO2 emissions increased both last year and the year before. Second, they are exporting over 100 coal-fired power plants through their Belt and Road project. So it's important to distinguish between what they want to accomplish at home for domestic purposes and for domestic stability, what they see as an economic advantage, and what they really care about when it comes to addressing the true challenge of global climate change. I think they're three different things.
Yeah. Well, I would think there's another element here, which is what you touched on around solar and wind, which is who among us is going to dominate the next generation of energy. Right. And in Texas, we have expanded our wind capacity dramatically. It's our second highest source of energy, electric energy. We are the #1 state for wind, not Iowa. Some people think Texas. But we also are investing, and there's a lot of private investment around solar. And I wanted to ask you about that, because obviously with the Chinese kind of dumping solar panels and their use of subsidies that I think ended last year, what's the current status of their efforts around the world with solar, and what's their goal there? And is it possible for us to compete? Are the tariffs that we have in place a part of that?
You know, I'm not sure where the tariffs are with regard to solar. Maybe somebody else on the panel knows. You know, is it possible for us to compete? It will be difficult. You know, China, because of its manufacturing capacity, you know, it provides, you know, cheap and good enough technology that can be used for much of the developing world. And I think that's a problem we're going to face also with the electric car market. We may have a Tesla. We may have the highest quality, highest performing sort of elements, whether it's solar energy or it's electric cars, but it's difficult to compete on the cost level.
Yeah. Well, for Texas, we're an energy state. I want us to be an energy state going forward, and that means dominating the renewable energy market and trying to find ways to compete with China. And so I would encourage my colleagues for us to continue to think about how we can invest in our own markets here, drive innovation, lower costs, consider what subsidies might be necessary. Ms. Sachs, briefly, if you could, President Obama reached a cyber agreement with China that was kind of broadly hailed. What's the status of that? Has it basically been ignored?
I think the consensus is that the Chinese side has not lived up to the commitments made during that. I would argue that the reason that there were some initial decline in cyber attacks after the agreement, I think it really had nothing to do with the agreement. Apologies to anyone in the room who was involved with it. I think that those are other factors, and probably Chinese cyber attacks just became much more sophisticated and difficult to detect.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A lot of questions, not enough time. Try to be focused on your responses. Would you describe that we have any sort of a comprehensive policy toward China with this administration today? Either of you? Any of you?
If we do, I don't know exactly what.
Okay, next.
I think it's incoherent.
I think that the end game may be decoupling the two systems. Steve Bannon had an op-ed recently in which he actually said, I may be radical, but I want regime change. So I think these are sort of the metrics we're discussing.
Dr. Economy?
I think maybe Matt Pottinger has a comprehensive strategy, but nobody else.
Okay. You know, I think there's a question. I mean, I view China as a competitor that could well become a very significant adversary. And for those of us who have spent some time in China and followed it closely, I think the notion of the Middle Kingdom and the rise, again, of the Middle Kingdom is really part and parcel of the Chinese leadership's focus, as well as many of the people. Having said that, you see President Xi as, I mean, he clearly is not a reformer, in my opinion. Among the leadership cadre there, are there anyone left that are really reformers?
Certainly there are, and I think even within the top 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Politburo, you could look to Wang Yang. I think Li Keqiang is actually fairly reform-oriented, and perhaps Han Zheng. I will just note that over the summer there was reportedly a lot of criticism of President Xi Jinping, and there was even discussion that there had been a vote about pushing him back.
And I hear that below the surface among some of my, yes.
But I think there's a question of what we mean by reform.
Well, I think President Xi will embrace reform if it helps him consolidate his power. I think he did that a couple years ago on the corruption thing.
I would distinguish also between economic and political reform.
Right.
I think there are people who believe the state should back away, the market should get a somewhat greater role. I'm not aware of people in the top ranks.
And that's a good segue, because with our current strategy with this, for lack of a better term, I call it poker tariff one-upmanship that we're engaged in, do you believe this is going to lead to an agreement here where negotiations, the next 48 hours may poise another play on this chess game?
I think our guess is probably as good as yours. I do think that the Chinese believe they have figured out how to deal with this president, which is basically give him a lot of, sort of superficial business deals at the highest level, but not structurally.
You can buy more soybeans, you can buy more corn, you can buy more of this and that.
Yeah.
But any real reforms with regards to enforcements of the World Trade Organization and copyrights and industrial espionage and the like that we really must require as a part of any agreement, I think it remains elusive.
Can I just say, I think it remains elusive, but I do think that Ambassador Lighthizer is trying to accomplish just that.
No, I've had several conversations with him about it, and he wants to have a mechanism in place so that when he leaves, we'll be able to enforce it. And I think that's what the difficulty is, it seems to me. Do you think going back to TPP as a strategy to kind of encircle the Chinese would be a better way to go about this?
I don't know that it would be better, but I think it would complement it, and it would reassert the economic pillar of our diplomacy, reestablish us as a leader in the region, and give us something, that we're actually doing that's positive as opposed to just defensive. So absolutely, if you have it in your power to start holding some hearings around rejoining the new CPTPP or doing some kind of U.S.
Well, some of us
ASEAN
have been
Act,
urging the
terrific.
administration to consider that with the different departments. Tell me, I was just last month with a group of our top military folks in Hawaii and the whole Pacific Indocom region, and we had a group of NATO representatives that two-day detailed briefing. And there was a lot of comments to the effect that they wish there was an equivalent of a NATO in the Pacific as it related to the current challenges that China is creating and juxtaposed with North Korea. Any thoughts or comments on that?
I don't think that's likely to happen.
No, I don't think it is either. But
in large part because other countries in the region would be reluctant to be drawn into such an arrangement.
That said, I do think that there are some things organically emerging because of China's activities. There's greater cooperation, for example, between Japan, Australia, the United States on the defense front. Certainly, we're seeing in the South China Sea among the claimant states more maritime domain awareness cooperation. So some networking is actually emerging, even if it's not formal.
My time's expired, but if I might, the chairman, entertain one quick last question. Do we really believe, I mean, because I don't think it's in China's interest, that they're going to be really constructive in supporting our efforts to denuclearize North Korea? It seems the last thing they wanted is a united Korean peninsula, in my perspective. And I think they just want to control North Korea to the degree that it continues to be a problem for us. I don't know. Am I wrong?
I think that is sound analysis.
I agree. I don't think that they're going to press hard enough to bring about those changes.
I would just say, I think there certainly has been a debate underway inside China, and there are certainly many scholars and sort of senior-type scholars who would favor denuclearized North Korea, who view North Korea as a millstone around China's neck. So I think there's an active debate, or there has been an active debate.
Well, as we know, China no exception. Countries do what they believe is in their own interest, and that's what we have to deal with from a realistic standpoint. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time and this important hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here and staying here. Nearly 7 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China and 40 years after the reestablishment of U.S.-Chinese diplomatic relations, China's become a political, economic, technological, and military competitor of the U.S. Obviously, as we've spoken about throughout this hearing, China's interests are increasingly global, having meddled in Australian politics, constructed its first military base in Djibouti, invested in more than a dozen ports throughout Europe, and now serving as the largest creditor in Latin America. Beijing is also the largest importer of oil from the Middle East and North Africa. Tomorrow I'll chair a subcommittee hearing that will examine Chinese influence in the Middle East, and I look forward to learning more about China's influence in that region. But today I want to just look at ways in which China uses non-traditional power plays to disrupt U.S. interests. And I'd like to submit for the record a Wall Street Journal article entitled "Flood of Trademark Applications from China Alarms U.S. Officials," dated May 5th, 2018, and I see no objection to submitting that for the record. This article describes the massive influx of trademark applications filed by Chinese entities and individuals. It describes the IP challenges the U.S. is facing in China and the monetary incentives some Chinese provincial governments are offering their citizens for successfully registered trademarks here in the U.S. According to the USPTO's Performance and Accountability Report, there were 6,323 applications in 2014 by Chinese entities and individuals. By 2015, the number of applications more than doubled to over 14,000. In 2016, there were almost 29,000, a 200% increase. In 2017, there were over 50,000 applications, and last year, a smaller but still significant uptick to close to 58,000 applications. So from the reporting that I've seen, a significant number of applications, even ones that end up being granted by the PTO, are fraudulent, with clearly photoshopped photographs of products or photos taken from competitors' websites rather than of their own products. We've spoken with the PTO about this problem. I know they're taking some steps to better identify and address the problem, but it still seems like malign actors in China have been very successful in gaming our system, either for local incentives or for more traditional trolling. In the end, we're left with too many fraudulent trademarks in our system that prevent Americans and other legitimate businesses from qualifying for legitimate trademarks considered too similar to suspicious and likely fraudulent Chinese trademarks. This deceptive practice is designed to not only harm U.S. financial interests, but it makes U.S. actors less competitive in the global marketplace. So the question, and late in the hearing, I guess I'll ask it generally, how best should the U.S. confront these sorts of IP challenges that we're seeing in China, specifically with the PTO and these applications? Dr. Friedberg?
Well, I have to say, I thought I was aware of most of the things that the Chinese are up to. I had not heard about this, so it's something else to worry about.
It's made this a successful hearing then.
So thank you. Just a general point, I'm afraid this is not a specific answer because I just don't know enough about this topic, but it seems to me that we've reached a point where we really can't continue to treat China as a normal trading partner in any one of a variety of different domains because of the nature of their system and the way in which they've been exploiting the openness of ours. So in a sense, I think we have to look at a blank sheet and ask ourselves, not just is this a non-zero-sum relationship, because it may be, but who's gaining more from it and how are the Chinese gaining from it? If we don't do that, I think we're going to get run in circles as we have about a variety of other issues related to intellectual property. So that's not an answer to your question, but I think we have to stand back from the whole relationship and look at it in its totality, given what has happened now with the evolution of China's system. We were open. We thought it would change them. Right. It didn't. What are we going to do about it?
So as we reevaluate, in response to U.S. criticism, Beijing approved this new foreign investment law to protect what they refer to as the legitimate rights and interests of foreign firms. Is that sufficient? And if not, what areas need further improvement? Dr. Economy?
So that's just the law. What we have to look at are the implementing regulations and what happens when companies try to do business. Because one thing that happens oftentimes with China when they do something that seems good, on the face of it, is that they put in place a number of, informal barriers to market entry or local regulations that are designed to achieve something that the state wants to achieve. So that in effect, yes, Visa and MasterCard can have access to the Chinese market, but 3 or 4 years later, they still have no license to operate. And by the way, even if they get a license at this point, it's basically useless.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this really important hearing, and thanks again to the witnesses for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Before I adjourn the hearing, I will have a question I'd like to ask each of our panelists, and that is, it was touched on before by a few people, is a Chinese move on Taiwan inevitable? Why don't we start with Dr. Economy?
I think unless there's a change in leadership, yes.
Ms. Sachs? Okay.
I agree with Dr. Economy. I think it matters, though, the how. I think that the way China is proceeding right now is they're basically trying to economically absorb Taiwan and isolate it enough internationally that no one notices what's going on or disrupting their political campaigns. Whether or not they choose to militarily invade, I think, will depend on a number of factors.
I don't think it's inevitable.
You think or you don't think?
I do not think it's inevitable, but that assumes that we're going to continue to do things to signal the seriousness of our commitment to Taiwan. I mean, we've played this game out as long as we have. I think we can keep on doing that for some period of time into the future.
Well, you've sort of answered my final question is, if so, what should we do about it?
Well, I think we need to continue the things we've been doing and expand some of the things we've been doing to strengthen our diplomatic ties with Taiwan, to signal to Beijing the seriousness of our commitment to try to incorporate them more fully into trade agreements and other arrangements and contributing to development in the region, and also militarily. We have to continue to sell them the equipment they need to defend themselves, encourage them to do things in their own interests to make it more difficult for China to coerce or attack them.
Dr. Economy, do you agree?
Yeah, I would just say, as I mentioned before, I think including them in the free and open Indo-Pacific in a much more substantive way is important. And I think we need to get other allies on board, Japan, Australia, the European Union. This can't just be about the United States sustaining Taiwan, but it needs to be a much more aggressive and global effort.
It's very, anybody else? Yes.
I would also think it's important to assess Taiwan in the context of a broader global trend of shrinking democracy globally and the rise of authoritarianism. And we tend to put Taiwan purely in a U.S.-China bilateral context, and actually it's part of a larger problem.
Thank you. We had a hearing a few months ago, and it was really interesting. Part of it was about NATO and what we should expect and what are the pitfalls and what will we be doing. And all the witnesses agreed that the biggest threat to NATO in the incoming years would be China rather than Russia, which struck me as very interesting since NATO was actually formed to stop the then Soviet Union from making moves. So I think China it was very interesting to have that kind of a statement. So I want to thank all our witnesses for their time and testimony today. This hearing has underscored the immense and cross-cutting nature of the U.S.-China challenge. And while smart competition with China is an imperative for U.S. foreign policy, it's clearly not just a foreign policy issue, but one that demands a whole of government and indeed whole of society response. So that's why we're doing a lot of things on China in the committee. I look forward to the outcomes of the subcommittee hearings that will take place this afternoon and tomorrow, and to our continued work on this committee on this pressing issue. So again, I want to thank our excellent witnesses Concludes the hearing, and the committee is adjourned. Thank you.